Chapter 1611. She didn't understand why President Qin still couldn't let go of that cruel woman after what had happened. He was still concerned about her life and death. Su Shircheng was useless, Yi Liangqiu was dead, and ATV would soon be finished. President Qin couldn't let go. After dealing with ATV, how would he deal with Yi Liangqiu in the end? Thinking of this, Xia Mian felt a chill in her heart. The answer couldn't be clearer. No matter what Yi Liangqiu did, as long as she didn't do anything to Lady Qin Anlin would forgive her. A gust of night wind blew, and Xia Mian suddenly felt very cold. She hugged herself and looked at the street lights of B City, feeling that she still had nothing. As for Yi Liangqiu, it seemed like she had lost everything. But in reality, it was just as Qin Anlin had said. She had always been his wife, and she had never changed. In the white corridor of the hospital, the sound of leather shoes stepping on the floor tiles was clearly heard in the dark. The nurse on duty was sleepy. She opened her eyes and looked at the handsome man in front of her. After a while she became more energetic. "Sir, it's past visiting hours. Which room is Yi Liangqiu in? I want to see her." Qin Anlin's slender fingers were on the duty desk. The nurse looked at the Patek Perrier watch, and then looked at the handsome face that shone like a diamond. "Miss Yi is in the ICU. She can only be visited at 4 o'clock in the afternoon every day." She added, "She has to be her immediate family. I'm her husband." Qin Anlin's voice was low. "I want to see her now." The nurse looked at him for a long time, and then said hesitantly, "Doesn't look like her." But the next second, her mouth was wide open as she looked at the man in front of her. She remembered that Miss Ye's husband was President Qin of King Entertainment. So the man in front of her was President Qin? Oh my God, he was even more handsome than a male star. The nurse's eyes were immediately filled with stars. She held her hand and looked at the handsome man in front of her. Qin Anlin pursed his lips and pinched it again. Only then did the young nurse wake up. She coughed lightly and said, "He's not awake yet. I can only take a look." Qin Anlin's expression didn't look too good. The nurse immediately walked in front of him and muttered, "What the hell? You're the one who begged me." However, since he was handsome, she would let it go. The door opened, and it was very quiet inside. In the plain white ward, Yi Liangqiu was lying quietly with an oxygen mask on. It was so quiet that it did not seem to be alive. At that moment, Qin Anlin felt a stabbing pain in his heart. It was very, very painful. He slowly walked over to her and looked at her sleeping face. "Yi Liangqiu, what is this?" His voice was low and hoarse. "Do you think I'll forgive you just like that? Do you think you can escape like this?" As he spoke, his eyes were already filled with warmth. It was only now that he knew how painful it was to want to love someone, but not be able to love her. He wanted to care for her, wanted to hug her but not be able to. He couldn't forgive her, but when she was in pain, he would be in more pain than her. He tortured her, provoked her, and watched her in pain. He thought that he would be happy, but the one who cared more was him. He bent down and whispered in her ear, "Don't you want to go against me? If you want to go against me, get up. Yi Liangqiu, get up." The pain in his chest was so unbearable that he was about to die. He knew that she was fine. She just didn't want to wake up. "Liangqiu, do you get tired too?" Chapter 1612. Suddenly, a black barrel of a gun was pressed against his forehead. Qin Anlin's entire body tensed up. He narrowed his eyes, but he didn't move. He believed that as long as he moved, the gun with a silencer would shoot through his head. "Anlin, you didn't think that you would end up like this, did you?" An old voice rang out. Then, Su Shircheng appeared out of nowhere and stood by the side of the bed. Qin Anlin looked up and slowly straightened his body. Naturally, the gun moved with him. But Qin Anlin was 186 centimeters tall, while the little killer was only 172 centimeters tall. It was very strenuous for him to stand on his tiptoes. They hadn't seen each other for a long time. Su Shircheng looked a lot thinner and older. He was in his early 50s. He used to be in high spirits, but now he looked like an old man. Qin Anlin's lips curled into a cold smile. "Su Shircheng, how much longer are you going to make use of her?" Even when his life was at stake, he still wanted to make use of her. "Anlin, this is the fundamental difference between you and me." Su Shircheng licked his lips. People who want to achieve great things have to cut off all emotions. Otherwise, if you have a weakness like yours, you will be easily killed. Su Shircheng's voice became cold. And if I kill you now, no one will know that the nurse outside has fallen asleep again. Qin Anlin stared at Yi Liangqiu's face for a long time before saying softly, "Is that so?" At this moment, Yi Liangqiu's eyes slowly opened. She looked at Qin Anlin quietly, and the black barrel of a gun in his forehead. Su Shircheng didn't notice that she had woken up. He was still smiling coldly. Of course, if he killed Qin Anlin, Liangqiu would be the biggest beneficiary of King Entertainment's shares. And now that Liangqiu was unconscious, it was his best opportunity. Su Shircheng raised his hand gently. "Don't dirty the bedsheets." He didn't want Liangqiu to be frightened when she woke up. He still treasured this daughter of his. It could bring him everything, and it could bring him supreme glory. However, the killer did not move for a long time, and his voice trembled. "Mr. Su, eldest miss is awake." Su Shircheng squinted and looked at the bed in disbelief. Yi Liangqiu lay there quietly, looking straight at Su Shircheng. They had an agreement, but Su Shircheng had violated it. Under such a gaze, Su Shircheng was a bit embarrassed. He coughed lightly. "I'm protecting you. I'm afraid he'll do something bad to you." The moment he said that, the atmosphere became a little awkward, because he had indeed done something improper to her today. Qin Anlin's eyes fell deeply on Yi Liangqiu's face, and his tone was calm and slow. "She is still my wife. Even if she does something wrong, it can't be said to be improper, right, Mr. Su?" Su Shircheng couldn't get out of this embarrassing situation and could only chuckle. "You can say so." Yi Liangqiu lay there, and her lips moved slightly. Her lips were very dry. She had a dream just now. It was a very long dream. There was Enlan, Muyun, Mumu and Momo. They were living together. The dream was very beautiful, so she didn't want to wake up. However, a voice pulled her back, and she opened her eyes with difficulty. Her Anlin was right in front of her. Su Shircheng was also in front of her, so she knew that she had woken up because he was in danger. "I want to say a few words to him." Yi Liangqiu turned her face and looked at Su Shircheng. Su Shircheng was embarrassed at this moment, because he had broken his promise to her. Chapter 16:13. Su Shircheng smiled lovingly. "Then Dad will come and see you tomorrow." Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything as she watched him walk out. Qin Anlin was still standing there, looking straight at her. "Why did you help me?" He laughed self-deprecatingly. "Everything will be solved if I die, including the child." Yi Liangqiu's gaze fell on his face, and her gaze was a little listless. Slowly, she closed her eyes and sighed. "Anlin, I'm a little tired." Her eyelids closed, and she actually fell asleep. Qin Anlin was surprised. He sat down to touch her forehead and pinched her, but she didn't wake up. She was stubbornly immersed in her own world. In the end, the doctor on duty was called over. The doctor was also very nervous. Firstly, it was because of Yi Liangqiu's identity, and secondly, it was because Qin Anlin seemed like he would blow up the hospital if anything happened. After a careful examination, the doctor finally heaved a sigh of relief. He got up and said to Qin Anlin, "She's just tired and wants to sleep." Qin Anlin was stunned. He grabbed the doctor's arm and asked again in disbelief, "She just wants to sleep?" The doctor smiled. "Yes, she just wants to sleep." Just as he was about to leave, he was caught again. Qin Anlin's voice was a little bitter. "Will she wake up?" The doctor pondered for a moment. "At least until 8 or 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." He smiled. "Looks like she can sleep a lot." 8 or 9 o'clock. After the doctor left, Qin Anlin was still thinking about these numbers. After a long time, he dimmed the lights. Under the dim light, she quietly slept. Her long black hair was scattered on the pillow. Just like on their wedding night, she also fell asleep like this. Qin Anlin didn't know how long it had been since he had a good sleep. With her here, he couldn't resist the temptation and slowly lay down beside her. He closed his eyes and fell asleep just like that. When the doctor made his ward rounds in the morning, he came over and saw two lying on the bed. This was the intensive care unit. What did a man want to do with a female patient in the middle of the night? The one on duty during the day was a female doctor. She immediately felt that this man was a beast. The nurse said that the patient's husband came to visit in the middle of the night, and he actually reached into the bed. The female doctor suddenly felt that this man was a pervert, and the one on the bed was not his wife. So he ordered the nurse beside him to call security. If this kind of thing was known by the higher-ups in the outside world, it would be terrible, and the hospital's reputation would be greatly damaged. The young nurse eagerly went to call them, and in less than 5 minutes, 4 security guards came in. Drag him out, and find a place to lock him up. Let the higher-ups deal with him later. The female doctor frowned. After she finished speaking, the security guards were just about to step forward when Qin Anlin woke up. His whole body was a little uncomfortable. He was afraid that he would squash Yi Liangqiu, so he only slept about 50 meters. When he opened his eyes, he saw a female doctor with a beautiful face. He rubbed his forehead and lay back down. Just a moment ago, he thought he saw Tang Yu, the female version of Tang Yu. Don't think that you can pretend to be dead. The female doctor gritted her teeth. Pervert, let go of our female patient. It was not strange for her to have such thoughts. Yi Liangqiu was a celebrity, and many crazy fans would do anything. She also thought that this was one of the crazy fans. Qin Anlin pressed his fingers on his eyes and said slowly, "It seems that the handover work in your hospital is not good." Chapter 16:14. The female doctor was stunned. What did he mean by that? Qin Anlin said slowly, "I'm Yi Liangqiu's husband, Qin Anlin." He said it unwillingly. Why? Did he look particularly wretched? The female doctor took a deep breath and stared straight at the man on the hospital bed. There was a light green hue on his smooth and good-looking chin. His tall nose gave off an air of nobility, and the shape of his face was square and stylish. Nothing else could be seen. She looked at the security guards around her and couldn't make a decision. Just then, the hospital director ran over, wiped his cold sweat, and scolded the female doctor in a low voice. "What's going on? Why are you being so rude to Mr. Qin?" The female doctor had a strong background, and the director usually doted on her. But at this moment, the director interrupted her rudely. "Stop it. Mr. Qin is Mr. Ye's husband. Get out, what are you talking about?" The female doctor was stunned. Was it true? Qin Anlin was still lying on the bed, as if he didn't see or hear the director's voice. The director sent the security guards away, bent over, and said gently, "Mr. Qin, if there's anything, call the nurses outside. Dr. Li is young and inexperienced, so please forgive her." Qin Anlin grunted indifferently and didn't say anything else. Seeing this situation, the director left silently. He was a considerate person, and when he came, he knew that Yi Liangqiu had already woken up once, but she was just asleep. After he went out, he reprimanded the group of people again. Only then did he feel at ease. He also sent a few nurses to stand guard at the door to watch over them. After the security guards were cleaned up, Qin Anlin lay on the bed, and his fingers slowly moved away as he looked at the ceiling. After a long time he said calmly, "I was treated as a pervert, so why didn't I wake up now?" Yi Liangqiu had been awake for a while, but she didn't get up, probably because she didn't want to face the fact that they were husband and wife. "I want to see how President Qin will deal with it." As Yi Liangqiu spoke, she turned her back to him and buried her face in the pillow. "Why are you sleeping here?" Annoyed that she had turned her back on him, he sat up and looked down at her. It would be a lie to say that he wasn't moved at all. After all, they had been husband and wife for so many years, although they didn't spend much time together. Her figure was of the finest quality, and even though she lay down in a thin gown, she was very attractive, even though it was simple. Half passionate and half angry, he suddenly lay back down and hugged her from behind, locking her body so that she could not escape. His voice was as tense as his body. "Why did something happen?" Yi Liangqiu looked down at his hand that was holding her. She didn't answer him directly. "Let go of me first." "I won't." Not only did he not let go, but his entire face was buried in her neck. His hot breath blew on the back of her neck, causing her to shiver uncomfortably. His voice was angry and unwilling. "Yi Liangqiu, if you think you can soften my heart by doing this, you're wrong." After a long time, Yi Liangqiu chuckled. "Why would I? Qin Anlin's body froze. He stared fixedly at her head, and then lowered his head again. He used a lot of force to bite down on the flesh of her neck, so fiercely that it seemed like he wanted to bite off a piece of her flesh. She cried out in pain, and then let him bite her without making a sound. He didn't relax until he tasted a trace of blood. He stepped back a little and looked at the red mark. Chapter 16:15. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips tightly and did not say a word. Her forehead was covered in sweat. Yi Liangqiu, I thought you wouldn't be in pain, he said coldly. Suddenly, he turned her over and took advantage of the situation to get on top of her. He covered her with his hands and held her palms high up with their fingers interlocked. It looked like a very intimate gesture, but only she could feel how tense he was and how cold his expression was. Next time, don't play this kind of trick with me. He stared into her eyes. This time she did not avoid it. She looked at him and chuckled softly. President Qin has been talking to himself all along. President Qin seems to be overthinking things. It's just a small accident, but President Qin has thought too much. She could not move her palms, so she lifted her body slightly and pressed her lips against his. Or President Qin still can't get over it? His gaze turned colder. At that moment, she was dressed in pure white, but she was also very charming. The more she looked like this, the more resentful he felt. He pinched her chin with one hand. Yi Liangqiu, you can be more shameless. The moment he let go, she suddenly reached out and hugged his neck. Her lips moved forward to block his body instantly froze. He looked at her coldly, but his body was honest. Her body was soft as though it was boneless. He had tasted that feeling many times, but it had never been as eroding as it was now. The joy and happiness that was filled with hatred was actually so heart-wrenching and irresistible. Once it was out of control, he kissed her passionately on the hospital bed, pouring out his unknown longing and struggle. His beard pricked her lips. Her nails scratched his neck, but neither of them had the time to care. They just hugged and kissed like that, as though they wanted to suck every inch of air out of each other's bodies. His heart, lungs, and internal organs were all aching. But no matter how painful it was, it could not stop this kiss. It was really just for a moment. They took a breath, and their gazes intertwined. Her eyes seemed to be filled with water. So much love and hate were entangled with each other fiercely. Then they kissed again. This time he hugged her, held her, and stumbled. The heat was on the verge of exploding. Dr. Li heard the noise and brought a few nurses in for the patient's safety. They were all stunned by what they saw. That scene was too unbearable to watch. Dr. Li subconsciously looked around. Was this still the ICU? How good would it be if every patient was as lively as this? The young female doctor coughed. Mr. Qin, the patient shouldn't do strenuous exercise. If she didn't come in, he would probably go all the way. Qin Anlin was still holding Yi Liangqiu. His voice was full of impatience and hoarse. Get out. Dr. Li still wanted to say something, but the nurses dragged her out. The hospital director had instructed them not to let Dr. Li act recklessly. With everyone gone, the atmosphere was a little strange. Qin Anlin suddenly let go of the person in his arms, and his gaze lingered on her collarbone. Her hospital gown was unbuttoned. She adjusted her gown and smiled lightly. President Qin, you can leave now. He sat by the bed, so annoyed that he wanted to smoke. Then, he heard the sound of her changing and suddenly turned around. His eyes were bloodshot as he watched her calmly changing her gown with her back to him. Chapter 16:16. She suddenly turned around. Their eyes met and his voice was hoarse. I'll go first. He walked to the door slowly. He had slept well, but he still felt exhausted. When he reached the door, Yi Liangqiu suddenly said, Anlin, how have you been? He placed his hand on the door handle and lowered his head. After a while he said, That's it. Don't go easy on me. Her voice was anxious, and there was a hint of unease in it. This time, he turned around and looked at her. I won't. He opened the door and walked out. She was right. He was indeed thinking too highly of himself. Yi Liangqiu looked at the closed door, but still buttoned up her clothes. She was going to be discharged now. Dr. Li came in and was a little surprised. He put his hand in the pocket of his white coat and said, "Miss Yi, you still need to stay in the hospital for 3 more days." "I'm fine," Yi Liangqiu said lightly, and then looked at Linda, who had rushed over. "Linda, I'll wait for you in the car. You can go through the discharge procedures." Linda nodded and then said worriedly, "Mr. Yi, you can't drive by yourself." "I know." Yi Liangqiu smiled and walked out. Linda stayed behind and fought with the female doctor. Half an hour later she went out. Seeing Mr. Yi sitting obediently in the front passenger seat, Linda smiled in satisfaction and started the car. Yi Liangqiu said calmly, "Go back to the Su mansion. Su Shiqing should still be there." Linda tilted her head and looked at her for a while before stepping on the accelerator. The car drove to the Su mansion. Yi Liangqiu didn't get out immediately. She placed her hand on the door and said to Linda, "Go back to the company first. I'll go to work tomorrow." Linda was a little touched. She knew that Mr. Yi didn't want to drag her into the Su family's internal strife. Yi Liangqiu got out of the car. After Linda drove the car away, she slowly walked towards the Su mansion. Su Shiqing sat on the sofa in the living room and played with Silent Mo. He truly doted on Silent Mo. Yi Liangqiu approached slowly. Su Shiqing raised his eyes and looked at her for a while. He lowered his head and patted Silent's little head lovingly. He ordered the servants beside him, "Bring the young master upstairs to play." Little Momo was only half a year old, and it was the time for him to have fun. When he saw Yi Liangqiu, his eyes were filled with desire. He hadn't stopped breastfeeding yet. Yi Liangqiu wanted to take this opportunity to stop breastfeeding, so she didn't hug him. After the servant silently carried the little boy upstairs, Yi Liangqiu looked at Su Shiqing and sneered, "If there's a next time, I promise you, everything you've been waiting for will be in vain." Being threatened by his daughter like this, Su Shiqing lost his face and suddenly exploded. He dragged his broken leg and stood up. "What are you talking about? I am your father," Yi Liangqiu sneered. "But none of the things you did were things that a father should do." She continued, "You know the situation of ATV very well. It's very easy to make it close down." Su Shiqing's eyes were filled with viciousness. "Aren't you afraid that I'll take Qin Pei's life?" "I'm afraid. Of course I'm afraid." Yi Liangqiu walked in front of him and looked down at him. "It's because I'm afraid that I still listen to you." Her body had an oppressive aura, and even Su Shiqing was a little stunned. Yi Liangqiu bent down and looked at him. "If Qin Pei dies, I won't have the face to explain it to Anlin's mother." Then she whispered into his ear, "Dad, do you still dream of Honka's death every night?" Chapter 16-17. Su Shiqing's eyes were wide open. His old eyes were covered with layers of loose eyelids, and they didn't look as sharp as before. He opened his mouth slightly, and his lips moved as he said with difficulty, "Don't mention her." "Why not?" Yi Liangqiu looked up at him and smiled coldly. "Dad, will you still dream of Honka lying in a pool of blood?" Su Shiqing's fingers on his knees trembled. He raised them and pointed at her shakily. "Don't say it, don't say it." After saying it a few times he muttered, "If you say it again I'll kill Qin Pei." "Kill him? I'll be free if I kill him." Yi Liangqiu leaned close to his face and imitated Su Shiqing's voice. "Dad, if you kill him, he'll go down and be Honka's wife again. Are you willing?" Su Shiqing looked up and stared at her. Yi Liangqiu smiled coldly and straightened her body. "If you're not afraid that Qin Anlin will point a gun at you again, it's better to find a place to hide and recuperate." Su Shiqing swallowed hard. "This is my home." "Yes, but you have to live in hiding like a shrinking tortoise." Yi Liangqiu's lips curled into a mocking smile. Su Shiqing was extremely unwilling, but he still called his men and was pushed away in his wheelchair. After he left, Yi Liangqiu finally relaxed completely. She sat on the sofa and leaned her head against the back of the sofa for a long time. She reached out to cover her eyes. Her eyes were a little hot. All she could see was Qin Anlin hugging her and asking her if it hurt. "Anlin, how could it not hurt? If it wasn't for the fact that Su Shiqing's men were watching Mu Yin at the airport, I might have watched you kill him. I'd rather Qin Pei die." But after calming down, she still didn't regret her choice, even though it was a little painful. After pausing for a moment, she slowly walked upstairs. Little Momo had already learned how to lie down and was playing on the bed. She slightly rearranged the room that Su Cheng used to live in and turned it into Silent's game room. Su Cheng's place had many little toys to begin with, so Silent couldn't be any happier. Yi Liangqiu felt a little dizzy, but she still played with him for a while. The little maid worriedly said, "Eldest miss, you should rest for a bit. You don't look too good. Get someone to prepare lunch," Yi Liangqiu lightly said, remembering that she had not eaten for almost 20 hours. The little maid immediately ran down to instruct the kitchen. Yi Liangqiu carried little Momo and raised him up high. Little Momo smiled at her. She also smiled and asked softly, "Momo, do you miss Daddy? Be good, Momo, and I'll take you to find Daddy." Yi Liangqiu pinched her son's little face. The little guy's body was especially strong, different from Mu Yun's delicate body in the past, so she didn't have to worry. Moreover, this child was cheerful, and when he smiled, there were two little dimples, very much like Anlin. It was probably because she pinched too much that the little guy was unwilling. He twisted around on her body and finally peed. Yi Liangqiu rested at home for a day before going to work at ATV. Linda followed behind and asked worriedly, "Mr. Yi, are you all right? Do you want to rest for a few more days?" "No need, I'm fine." Yi Liangqiu shook her head and sat down. "Is there any news from King Entertainment? Has there been a date to sign the contract?" Chapter 16:18. Yi Liangqiu interrupted her. "There are so many platforms, and they can't stop her from becoming famous. It's better to maximize the benefits." Linda still didn't understand. Mr. Yi and Mr. Su were supposed to be enemies, so why did he still try his best to support ATV? When she asked cautiously, Yi Liangqiu looked at her for a long time before replying, "You'll know in the future." She still couldn't completely trust Linda, so she wouldn't tell her some things unless it was a critical moment. Linda nodded. "I understand, Mr. Yi." Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. "Go out first, I'll read some documents." Linda went out. Yi Liangqiu frowned slightly, looked at the documents in her hand, and then put them down. She flew to Hong Kong on Saturday and Sunday, and it was already 10 o'clock in the evening when she returned. In the dead of night, she took a car back from the airport. Along the way, there were billboards advertising the latest sanitary pads, and the spokesperson was the unknown Xia Mian. Sanitary pads. Yi Liangqiu smiled. It was a good match for her teen drama. Annoyed, she didn't want to see it anymore, so she rolled up the window. Xiao Zhang, the driver, said, "Mr. Yi, it's Mid-Autumn Festival in a few days. How are you going to celebrate with Mr. Su?" In the eyes of outsiders, Su Shircheng was an old man, and Mr. Yi was having a hard time taking care of Su Shircheng while working at the company. Mid-Autumn Festival? Only then did Yi Liangqiu remember that it was Mid-Autumn Festival again. So fast. She pursed her lips and remembered that it was her birthday in 2 days. Her last birthday was still vivid in her mind, and Anlin gave her the biggest surprise of her life. Every time she dreamed of it, she would wake up in tears. Xiao Zhang didn't notice what she was thinking and said, "Mr. Su will be happy." "Yes." Yi Liangqiu smiled gently. Then she looked up at Xia Mian's billboard, feeling it was a bit dazzling. Just then her cell phone rang. She looked at the caller ID and didn't want to answer it, because it was from Qin Anlin. The phone rang again and again. Xiao Zhang wondered, "Mr. Yi phone." Yi Liangqiu handed the phone to him. "Tell him I'm home, and I left my phone in the car." Little Zhang was young and quick-witted. Furthermore, how could he not know the caller ID? Thus he picked up the call. His voice was calm and natural. "President Qin, right? President Yi's phone was left in the car. Right, President Yi is already home." With that he hung up. Little Zhang returned the phone to Yi Liangqiu, not daring to ask any more questions. Yi Liangqiu didn't say much. He leaned against the back of the chair and whispered, "Turn down the air conditioner. I want to sleep for a while." Xiao Zhang, and Xiao Liangqiu Xiao Zhang, Liangqiu, Xiao Zhang. She had once stood at such a high position. She should have been the brightest star. But now she had to take over business matters. She must be exhausted. Yi Liangqiu used to act in literary films, so she didn't have much of a connection with money. Therefore, it was hard for people who didn't know her to imagine her doing business. The black RV drove steadily on the highway, and an hour later, they arrived at the Su mansion. Mr. Yi, we're here. Xiao Zhang's voice was a bit soft. He had been sitting there for 5 minutes, but Mr. Yi didn't wake up, so he had to call him. Yi Liangqiu sat up straight. We're here. Chapter 1619. Xiao Zhang nodded, and immediately got out of the car. He opened the door for her. Mr. Yi, slow down. It just rained in B City. He picked up the phone again. Don't forget your phone. Yi Liangqiu looked at it for a long time before picking up the phone. Xiao Zhang said goodbye to her, and she watched the car drive away. The phone in her hand vibrated. She was shocked and almost threw it away. It was a message from Qin Anlin. There were only a few words. Where did you go? Yi Liangqiu didn't reply, because there was no need. She turned around and went upstairs. But that night, she didn't sleep well. In her dreams, he asked her, where did she go? Xiaomian's billboards were everywhere. She didn't sleep well that night. When she went to sign the contract on Monday afternoon, she didn't have much strength. Her eyes were even a little green. This time, Qin Anlin didn't bring Xiaomian with him. He only came with Kaim. The contract was quickly signed. The assistants of both parties packed up and left quickly, leaving the meeting room to Mr. Yi, President Qin. Yi Liangqiu wanted to leave, but Qin Anlin stopped her and said in a calm tone, "What's up in Hong Kong?" It seemed that he knew. Yi Liangqiu didn't avoid his eyes. She looked straight into his eyes and smiled. "Yes, I went to see Mr. Du. ATV wants to cooperate with Mr. Du's company." Qin Anlin's voice was slightly cold. "Do you know Du Yuesheng's background?" "Yes," Yi Liangqiu said coldly. "Is President Qin worried about me? Then why did you provoke him?" Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes. "Are you crazy?" She didn't say anything. She just looked at him quietly. "Is ATV that important to you? Or is Su searching important to you?" He tried to be calm, but found it difficult. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. "If there's nothing else, President Qin, I'll leave first." She wanted to leave, but he immediately stood up and grabbed her hand. He looked at her with burning eyes. "Aren't you going to ask me why I helped Xiaomian?" Yi Liangqiu's body froze. She carried him for a while before she slowly turned around. She looked at him and sneered. "You've done it." His fingers gripped her hand so tightly that it hurt. Suddenly he let go of her hand. "Yi Liangqiu, good job." Yi Liangqiu didn't get angry. Instead she laughed. "Didn't you want me to have such a reaction? Qin Anlin, you think you're great, but you're threatening me now. If I don't go back, you'll sleep with another woman, right?" This was the first time in almost a year that they had argued so fiercely. And he had started it. Xiaomian became their cannon fodder. What if it is? He pulled her close and held her in his arms. He was so tall that she could only awkwardly look up at him. Yi Liangqiu looked at him and stomped hard on him. She had obviously used so much force, but he didn't even frown. "Then sleep." She sneered. "President Qin, do you want me to congratulate you?" His face was livid. He had used so much force that he could almost break her in half. She still looked at him stubbornly. "I find that you're still so hateful." He gritted his teeth and lowered his head to kiss her, but his face was full of disgust. Yi Liangqiu turned her face away and didn't let him kiss her. "President Qin, don't kiss me with that mouth of yours. Even if you don't think it's dirty, I do." He froze for a moment and smiled even colder than her. "Really? Why didn't you think it was disgusting when you climbed into my bed?" He cupped her face, stared at her with narrowed eyes, and kissed her angrily again. Chapter 1620. In the end, she fell on the desk in embarrassment. Qin Anlin didn't touch her. He just squinted his eyes and carefully examined her. She also noticed it. She spat out one word angrily. "Pervert." It turned out that he was the one who was jealous. Qin Anlin took a few steps back and leisurely lit a cigarette. "Put on your clothes, Mr. Yi. I'm not in the mood." She was still lying there and couldn't move for a long time. Qin Anlin leaned against the wall a few steps away. He blew out a smoke ring and looked at the person on the table with a slightly blurred gaze. She was embarrassed, but also the most seductive. "Cut off contact with Du Yuesheng." he said in a slightly domineering manner. Yi Liangqiu's fingers grabbed the edge of the table and slowly straightened her body. Then, she sat on the chair and tidied up her clothes. If I ask you not to support Xia Mian, will you? She looked at him. Qin Anlin, don't use those double standards on me. He smoked and frowned. Xia Mian was selected by herself. I didn't want to support her. Really? Who was the one who said that she couldn't stay in B City? Yi Liangqiu said in a stiff voice. After saying it, she also felt that it was meaningless to say it. Qin Anlin looked at her deeply. Do you care? I can expel her from B City right now. He looked straight into her eyes. Provided that you leave ATV and testify against Su Shiqing. Yi Liangqiu took out a cigarette box from her bag. She didn't usually smoke, so she was just pretending. As soon as she took out the cigarette, Qin Anlin pressed her hand and looked like a storm was brewing. You smoke. Yi Liangqiu, you're still in your adultery phase, aren't you? He grabbed her hand, his face full of anger. Yi Liangqiu turned her face away. No. But her face still quietly blushed. The crimson color spread from her cheeks to the back of her ears. It was extremely beautiful. Really? Qin Anlin's voice was hoarse. He bent down and hugged her from behind. His hands went to the front and easily restrained her. He rubbed her a few times to get the answer he wanted. After that, he was reluctant to let go, but he had no choice. But as soon as he let go, his body was hugged by her. Yi Liangqiu, he cried out and looked down at her. Yi Liangqiu held him with one hand and unbuttoned his shirt with the other. His black shirt was slightly open, but she only took a glance before buttoning it up for him again. What is this? His voice was slightly hoarse as he grabbed her fingers. His hands were almost trembling, and they were scorching hot. President Qin, consider it a gift. She also checked his body, and there was nothing suspicious. Qin Anlin was silent for about 2 seconds before he finally understood her intention. He took a step back, took her cigarette pack, rubbed it, and threw it into the trash can. Don't smoke anymore. Then he looked at her. Is Momo okay? She looked up and stared at him for a long time before saying softly, Very good. Take a look at the photo, he said calmly. Then, he took her phone and opened it. He sent little Momo's photo to his phone, but he didn't ask to meet her. Yi Liangqiu clumsily buttoned up her shirt, but after buttoning it up, the shirt seemed a little small. His gaze swept over there and paused for a while before he said calmly, Mr. Yi, let's do this. You guys confirm the date of the release and inform us, so that we can do the publicity. Chapter 1621. Qin Anlin left first, leaving Yi Liangqiu alone. Linda came in carefully. Seeing that Mr. Ye's hair was a little messy, Linda's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if Mr. Yi was hurt or not. Yi Liangqiu's voice was very calm. Wait for me outside. Linda nodded and left. After she left, Yi Liangqiu lowered his head and examined himself. She admitted that she had seduced Qin Anlin today. It wasn't because she wanted to have sex with him, but because she wanted to keep his heart. In the long years to come, she didn't know if he would be angry at her like he used to be. She wasn't afraid. She looked down, smiled, and slowly walked out. Because she was lonely, she deliberately didn't think about her birthday. On her 28th birthday, she worked overtime in the company until 8 o'clock. When she left, the road was still full of Xia Mian's billboards. Her phone rang. She stopped in front of a red light and took a look. It was a video message from Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi and Tang Yu were on vacation in France, but she still remembered her birthday and sent a video message to congratulate her. Liangqiu, I'll bring you the gift when I come back. Pei Chichi smiled sweetly. Behind her was the night view of Paris. Yi Liangqiu's eyes softened, and she silently said, Thank you. She didn't go home directly. She had already fallen asleep. Her phone rang again, and it was Ying Jia. Liangqiu, do you have time to come out for dinner? I just got off work. Ying Jia sounded a little tired. Yi Liangqiu nodded. Okay, I'll see you in half an hour. After hanging up, she turned the car around. When she arrived half an hour later, Ying Jia was already there. She sat by the window and waited. When she saw Yi Liangqiu, she waved at her. Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu sat down. I didn't know if you were free, So I called you at the last minute. Ingjie smiled faintly. Yi Liangqiu shook her head. I'm not busy. Ingjie suddenly took out an exquisite box. Birthday present. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and looked up. There was surprise in her eyes. Ingjie smiled. No matter how old you are, you're still that 19-year-old girl. After that, he gestured for Yi Liangqiu to open the box. Inside was a crystal music box. The first movie Yi Liangqiu starred in was engraved with laser technology, and the music was the theme song. That's great. Yi Liangqiu looked up. Thank you, Ingjie. She knew that this was not cheap. It was custom-made, and would cost at least 100,000. Ingjie smiled. What are you thanking me for? As long as you're happy, let's take advantage of today, and have some fun together. Yi Liangqiu looked at her for a long time before asking softly, Ingjie, have you been unhappy lately? Why not? Ingjie smiled. You're so silly. The waiter came over to serve the dishes. After the dishes were served, Ingjie started eating. I'm already in my 40s, and there are many unhappy things. Usually, I go home alone, and there's no one to talk to. Today is your birthday, but it's more like I'm looking for someone to accompany me. After that, she drank half a glass of aperitif. The golden liquid flowed down her throat. It was a little spicy, but Ingjie did not even frown. Yi Liangqiu looked at her and said softly, If you're lonely, find someone to accompany you. I won't. If it's not the one I want, there's no point in finding someone. Ingjie held on to the glass and laughed softly. Chapter 1622. Let's stop talking. Let's eat. Ingjie was also a straightforward person. She wouldn't be so gloomy all the time. Yi Liangqiu nodded and chatted happily, but they all skipped the topic of Qin Anlin. Although Xia Mian was under Ingjie's care, her heart was always on Yi Liangqiu's side. In the end, she hesitated for a moment and said, I know that you and President Qin haven't divorced. Look at that Xia Mian. She's not a law-abiding person. Yi Liangqiu didn't have anything to hide in front of her. She nodded and said, I know. There's nothing between President Qin and her. Ingjie sighed. Don't be too bad to him. Understand. Yi Liangqiu smiled bitterly. I know. Ingjie didn't mention it again. She wasn't a person who didn't know her limits. The two of them finished the meal in silence. At the end of the dessert, a small cake was magically given to them. After eating the cake, it'll be your birthday. Ingjie smiled. Yi Liangqiu felt a little warm in her heart. She made an exception, and finished a small piece. When the two of them were about to leave, after passing through the long aisle, the door of a private room on the side opened. The sound coming from inside made her whole body tense up. It was Qin Anlin's voice. Then the person inside walked out. Not only him, but also little Mu Yin, who was holding little Mumu in her arms. When little Mumu was sent away, it was only a week old. Now it had grown up. She could tell at a glance that it was her little Mumu. As for Mu Yin, she hadn't seen him for almost a year. It wasn't that she didn't want to, but that she didn't dare to. The air seemed to have frozen. She looked at her children, her red lips trembling slightly, and she couldn't say a word for a long time. Mom. Mu Yin rushed over, hugged her waist, and buried his little face in her arms. It was rare for this child to act like a spoiled child, but after not seeing her for a year, he missed his mother. Yi Liangqiu reached out and hugged her son. He had grown taller and stronger. It had been so long since she last saw him, but he was still so warm towards her. She felt extremely guilty, but she couldn't say it out loud. She reached out to rub the little fellow's hair and choked with emotion. Mu Yin. The little fellow snuggled in her arms for a long time. Suddenly, he raised his eyes and ran over to pick up little Mumu. He presented her to his mother and said fawningly, This is my younger sister. He was clearly her child, but Yi Liangqiu actually felt a sense of fear. Little Mumu had been raised very well, and could compete with Yi Liangqiu. At this time, she was also eating her fingers and blinking at Yi Liangqiu. Suddenly, little Mumu leaned over and kissed her. His saliva was all over her. The little fellow squeaked and laughed cheerfully. He looked like a lively child, and was very similar to Momo. This was a little different from her. Perhaps Qin Anlin had been like this when he was young. holding the little bun in her arms. Yi Liangqiu couldn't bear to put it down. Her face was pressed against little Mumu, and her eyes were a little warm. I heard from Yingjie that it's your birthday. Qin Anlin's voice was indifferent. What a coincidence. Yi Liangqiu looked up at him. Yes. A little hope rose in her heart. Did he specially ask her to meet the children on this day? Just as she was thinking about it, he interrupted her mercilessly. Mr. Yi, don't think too much. It's just a coincidence. After saying that, he hugged little Mumu and kissed him. Let's go home. Little Mumu lay on his shoulder and looked back at Yi Liangqiu. Little Mumu liked the fragrant smell on her body. Chapter 1623. This was the child that she had given birth to. It had only been a few days, and she had sent it away. Now that she saw it, she felt very sad and bitter. She wanted Qin Anlin to put the child down and let her see it more. But her throat seemed to be blocked, and she couldn't say anything. Qin Anlin turned around and held little Mumu in his arms. He looked at Yi Liangqiu coldly, then lowered his head and looked at little Mumu. Little Mumu hugged his father with his chubby little hands and cried out twice. Then, he leaned softly into Qin Anlin's arms. He looked like a little white sheep, and was extremely cute. Yi Liangqiu was a little envious, and looked at him for a long time. Qin Anlin's face was pressed against the little sheep, and he held the little guy up with his palm. The little guy cried out softly. Yi Liangqiu looked at him, and her eyes became even hotter. To her, little Mumu was the best birthday present. Whether it was intentional or just a chance encounter, she was very happy. Her fingers gently touched little Mumu's fat calf. Mumu, you have to listen to Daddy. Qin Anlin glanced at her. I thought he didn't have a mother. He didn't move, nor did he have any intention of leaving. She paused for a long time before she realized that he wanted her to hug Mumu. Could she really? She carefully picked up little Mumu, afraid that the little guy wouldn't be willing. However, the little sheep was obedient and let her hug him. Yi Liangqiu knew that no matter how reluctant she was, she could only hug him for a while. Letting Mumu rely on her would only cause more harm to the child. So she returned Mumu to Qin Anlin after a while. Beside her, Qingxiu said indifferently, Young master, the car is already waiting. She didn't communicate with Yi Liangqiu at all. From the moment Yi Liangqiu stood on Su Shirqing's side, she was no longer her young madam. Yi Liangqiu could naturally feel Qingxiu's attitude. She naturally felt a little sad in her heart, but she only smiled. Qin Anlin didn't stay any longer. He turned around and left, with Crispy Sleeve following behind him. I'll steal my sister out in the future. Little Mu Yun's voice was low as he waved at Yi Liangqiu. He was only a 9-year-old child, but he was actually so sensible and experienced. Yi Liangqiu felt a little sad. She went forward to hug him and said softly, Mommy will be with Mu Yin in the future. Little Mu Yin nodded obediently. He had been raised by Yi Liangqiu since he was young, so he trusted his mother. I'll send you out to find your father. Yi Liangqiu turned around and nodded at Yingjie. Then, she personally sent little Mu Yin to the entrance of the hotel. A black Maybach was parked in front of the hotel. Qingxiu and little Mumu had already gotten into the car. Qin Anlin leaned against the door, obviously waiting for little Mu Yin. In the strong night wind, he leaned against the car door and smoked quietly. Yi Liangqiu approached and opened the door for little Mu Yin to get into the car. The door closed and she took 2 steps back. She was only 1 step away from him. Her voice was very soft. Anyway, Anlin, thank you. I said it was a coincidence. Qin Anlin puffed out a smoke ring and said lightly. She looked at him deeply. I'm leaving. When she turned around, her eyes were red. He walked forward step by step, using all of his strength. On a night like this, she wanted to hug him and feel his warmth. However, the only thing she could do was to leave him. Chapter 1624. Yi Liangqiu had some misgivings at first, but after a while she smiled and said, Okay. Yingjie looked up at her boss again. Qin Anlin finished smoking the cigarette in his hand, glared at Yingjie, and then got into the car. When he buckled his seat belt and started the car, Su Xiu said, Young master, are you still not going to forgive young madam? Qin Anlin looked ahead intently. After a long time he said softly, "There's no such thing as forgiveness." Sushio didn't understand what he meant, but she didn't dare to ask anymore. There was music in the car. After a while Sushio said, "This is Miss Ya's song, right? It's quite nice." Qin Anlin didn't notice it at first, but now that he paid attention, he realized that it was true. Sushio continued, "Miss Ya is not bad. She cares about young master, and takes care of young master, and young Mississippi young master. You can consider her." Qin Anlin tightened his grip on the steering wheel. After a long time he reminded her, "Aunt Sue, I'm not single." "It's not a solution to keep dragging it on," Sushio said earnestly. "Young master can't always be single. I'm old too. In the future, someone has to take care of Mu Yun and Mumu. I'll take care of them myself. Don't mention this in the future." Although Qin Anlin's tone was indifferent, he was obviously unhappy. Sushio didn't say anything. She hugged Mumu and sighed. "The child is still young. You have to think more about him." Qin Anlin didn't reply. He first sent Sushio back to the old mansion, and then he took the two children back to the apartment. During the day, he sent the children to Sushio's place, but at night, he took care of them himself. This lasted for about half a year. It was very hard, but he stubbornly persisted. He stopped the car and asked Mu Yin to get out of the car by himself. He carried Mumu down. The little guy was asleep, and it was very comfortable to hold him. The chubby little ball was lying in his arms. Qin Anlin lowered his head and kissed his little daughter. His eyes were filled with gentleness. Holding his little daughter in one hand and little Mu Yin in the other, he arrived at the apartment and turned on the lights. When the lights were on, Qin Anlin's eyes fell on the sofa. It was empty, but he longed for someone to sit there, someone who would never appear. She lowered her eyes and smiled. "I'm home." Little Muyin carried little Mumu from his arms. It was quite strenuous for her to carry him. Qin Anlin went to turn on the bathwater. Poor little Mumu was woken up by Papa and his brother. He opened his big cute eyes, looked at the bubbles around him, and burst into tears. Little Muyin squatted down and helped her father bathe the little fellow. She was like a little cow, very cute. Just like that little milkshake bun. Therefore, before the little yellow bun appeared, he was willing to take care of his sister. Little Mumu cried for a long time, but when she realized that it was useless, she looked at her papa with her big tear-filled eyes. The baby was only 6 months old. Mumu's hair was thin yellow. It was cute and funny. Qin Anlin smiled, picked up a towel, and began to bathe his little daughter. Mu Yin didn't play with the little sheep anymore, so he went to take a bath. Qin Anlin smiled. He picked up a towel and began to bathe his little daughter. Little Mu Yin didn't have the little sheep to play with, so she obediently went to bathe herself. After washing the baby, he carried her to the bedroom with a towel. The little girl slept with him, while Mu Yin slept by himself. After washing the baby, he carried her to the bedroom with a towel. The little girl slept with him, while Mu Yin slept by himself. He put the little girl on the bed and wiped her dry with a towel. The little girl rolled on the bed happily. Chapter 1625. The corners of Qin Anlin's mouth curled up slightly as he lowered his head and kissed the little girl's belly. It smelled so good. He helped little Mumu put on the onesie and then carried her to the kitchen. He carried the baby in one hand and quickly made milk powder with the other. His movements were so skillful that it was as if he had practiced it thousands of times. As soon as little Mumu smelled it, she sucked greedily. Qin Anlin carried her to the bedroom and lay on her side, letting the little girl lie in his arms. Her two chubby little hands held the bottle, and she ate happily. She had been eating milk powder since she was young, so she was very satisfied. It wasn't that Qin Anlin couldn't find a nanny for her, but he just didn't want to. Little Mumu drank more than half a bottle and was sleepy. Her eyelids were fighting. She held the bottle and drank 2 mouthfuls, then let go. After a while, she held the bottle and drank 2 more mouthfuls in a daze. Finally, her little face tilted and the bottle slipped from her hand. The little guy squeezed into Qin Anlin's embrace and placed a small hand on his Xiong's chest. Every single fingernail on that chubby little hand was pink, Especially the fingernails, they were all clean. Qin Anlin lowered his head and looked at her. He couldn't get tired of looking at her. Although he was angry with Yi Liangqiu, he loved this child very much. If he had to choose between Momo and little Mumu, he would rather have little Mumu by his side. Momo was a boy, and little Mumu was so fragile and small. He sighed and couldn't help but think of Momo. She was also his child. How could he not think of her? After taking a shower, Yi Muyin came in wearing a bathrobe. After running in, he climbed onto the bed and said, "I'll take care of Mumu." Qin Anlin kissed his son. This child was so sensible that it made his heart ache. He gently let go of little Mumu, and Yi Muyin quickly replaced him. But a tragedy happened. Little Mumu woke up with a start and opened his eyes blankly. Then he subconsciously went to look for his milk bottle. He didn't find the milk bottle, and instead bit his brother. Yi Muyin was helpless. Mumu! But little Mumu couldn't care less. He quickly took 2 bites and didn't eat anything. Cry, cry, cry. Yi Muyin quickly stuffed the bottle into her mouth. Qin Anlin smiled and walked into the bathroom with his clothes. When he came out, the 2 little ones were asleep, their heads leaning against each other. Little Mumu even put one of his fat legs on little Mu Yen's waist. Qin Anlin covered the children with the quilt and looked at them quietly for a long time. Then he turned around and went out to the living room. Sitting on the sofa in front of the French window, he poured himself a glass of wine. The night was just right, but he didn't feel sleepy. Now, she was drinking with Jia. Would he be drunk? Would he have an accident on his way back? Qin Anlin took the phone and put his finger on it for a long time. But he didn't make the call. What was this? She had nothing to do with him. Why did he have to worry about her so much? After a long time, he put down the phone and sat there, sipping the red wine and looking at the night sky. It wasn't until 2 o'clock in the morning that his phone rang. It was Jia's phone call. He picked up almost immediately. It was a young man's voice. "Sir, we're at Night Bar. There are 2 ladies here who are drunk and haven't paid the bill. We're going to fake it." Night Bar? Drunk to death? Haven't paid the bill. Chapter 1626. Qin Anlin sat in the car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. Occasionally, the light from the window shone into the car, shining on his expressionless face and bottomless black eyes. But it seemed as if there were flames dancing in his eyes. The black sports car sped in the dark night, like a black bullet. Half an hour later, the car stopped at the night bar. At 3 o'clock in the night, the bar had been cleared, and only a few waiters were cleaning up. However, Qin Anlin still saw Jia and Yi Liangqiu at a glance. They were both lying on the table, and there were more than a dozen empty bottles on the table. He knew how much Yi Liangqiu could drink, and it was impossible for her to get drunk after drinking so little. However, when he approached, his face darkened, because there were 2 bottles of wine. The 2 women drank 2 bottles of wine, and there was so much beer. Were they crazy? The bartender saw Qin Anlin walk in, followed him, and took out a bill. "This is the bill for these 2 ladies, a total of 86,000 yuan. Qin Anlin's face darkened, and he took out a card for the bartender to swipe. Yi Liangqiu heard the noise, and she was still drinking with Jia. At this time, she raised her eyes, looked at Qin Anlin, and closed her eyes again, and said with a drowsy voice, "I'll pay myself." Jia also drank too much. She was usually such a strict person, but at this time, she was actually drooling. She leaned on the table and smiled vaguely. "Liangqiu, pay tens of thousands more, and let the most handsome man here drink with us, and then bring him to the hotel." Yi Liangqiu also smiled, and her fingers crookedly took out 200 yuan from her wallet. "This is 2 million by the most handsome male prostitute here." The bartender was also used to seeing such female customers, and he had seen many of them, who could do anything when they were drunk. He coughed lightly. "We are doing business here. Liangqiu," he said, "they're serious." Jia, with tears and snot running down her face, slapped the table and laughed like a child. "Then why don't you let them try being serious?" Yi Liangqiu raised her hand at her and stood up shakily. Using Qin Anlin as a support, she walked to the bartender. She was very tall, and hooked her arms around the bartender's neck. Her face was right in front of his, and her voice was sweet and alluring. Are you selling it? Although the bartender was used to seeing all kinds of beauties, the one in his arms was truly extraordinary. Her beauty, her softness, was like a kind of seductive fragrance, deeply intoxicating. The bartender didn't know what to do, but just as he was hesitating, Qin Anlin pulled Yi Liangqiu back. Her body fell into his arms, and her head bumped his chin. Qin Anlin let out a muffled groan and reached out to press her body. He looked at the bartender coldly. What are you waiting for? Yi Liangqiu struggled. Let go of me. Let you go seduce other men. He held her body and didn't let her move, and his voice was as cold as ice. Yi Liangqiu turned her body sideways, and her eyes were a little blurred. Anlin. His jaw tightened, giving off a seductive vibe. She looked at him in a daze, and then stroked his chin with her fingers. There was a faint green color there, and it was slightly prickly. She felt that it was fun, and so she played with it for a while. He let her do as she pleased, but his expression didn't look good. After a while, she leaned on his shoulder and laughed softly. You look like my ex-husband. Chapter 1627. Yeah. She was still smiling foolishly as she buried her face in his shoulder. My ex-husband Qin Anlin. She leaned close to his ear. Let me tell you a secret. My ex-husband can't do it. This time, Qin Anlin's face was completely green. He glared at her, but she just laughed on his shoulder and exhaled. Can you do it? Qin Anlin stood up straight. I'll let you know if you can or can't. He turned his head and looked at Ying Jie with a complicated expression. At that moment, Ying Jie was sitting there calmly. She lit a cigarette and started smoking. Looking at Qin Anlin's gaze, Ying Jie smiled faintly. Take her away. Leave this to me. Even after drinking so much alcohol, Ying Jie was still the same Ying Jie. She was calm as usual. That was why she was the best manager in the entertainment industry. Qin Anlin nodded. I'll get Kaim to come and pick you up. No matter how drunk he was, he couldn't drive the car. But he didn't realize that when Ying Jie heard Kaim's name, her body trembled. With that, Qin Anlin locked Yi Liangqiu's fingers. After taking her things, he walked towards the door. Yi Liangqiu didn't want to let him go. She used her bag to hit his shoulder. She hit him so hard that he got angry and carried her on his shoulder. Let go of me. She felt terrible. Not only did she feel dizzy, her stomach was churning and she wanted to vomit. But he didn't let go and carried her on his shoulder. At the entrance of the bar, she finally couldn't take it anymore. She locked her fingers on his shoulder. Qin Anlin was stunned. He put her down and watched as she ran to the side of the road and threw up. After she was done, she leaned against the side of the garden, as if she had fallen asleep. He stood there and looked at her quietly. He wanted to ignore her, but after taking 2 steps, he cursed under his breath and came back with large strides. He picked her up and angrily used his hand to wipe away the stain at the side of her mouth. It was unwise to send her back at this time. In the end, he decided to send her to a hotel and get a room for her. 300 meters ahead was the GM. Qin Anlin carried her on his back as they walked on the streets of B City. The neon lights shone on their faces, blurred and blurred, just like the relationship between them. No matter how cold he was, he couldn't let her go. Yi Liangqiu leaned on his shoulder and put her lips to his neck. Qin Anlin, isn't he your ex-husband? Don't you think I'm a pretty boy? His tone was not good, and his face was dark. Yi Liangqiu, however, acted as if she hadn't heard anything as she smiled foolishly. Kaim is waiting for Su Cheng. But what about Ying Jie? Qin Hong Anlin frowns. Ying Jie? Does this have anything to do with Ying Jie? Ying Jie had been at King Entertainment for many years. He had long thought that she had no interest in marriage or men. Ying Jie likes Kaim. Yi Liangqiu hugged him tightly and sighed. And you asked Kaim to pick her up. Qin Anlin's attention was diverted. He wanted to ask her if she was really drunk, or just pretending. But he didn't ask, and only slowed down his pace. Perhaps, it was only when she was drunk that they could be together like before without any scruples. He walked for more than half an hour for the short distance of a few hundred meters. Her hands tightened, so tightly that his heart heated up, and he almost couldn't breathe. Amlin. Amlin. She called his name. Do you hate me? Chapter 1628. Qin Amlin had already carried her into the GM's lobby. He patted her and said, "Yi Liangqiu, you stink." She was so drunk, and yet she still wanted to seduce men? The GM employees all knew Qin Amlin and Yi Liangqiu. It was the middle of the night, and yet this couple, who were not together, had come to the hotel so late at night. It was quite surprising. No matter how surprised she was, she quickly handed the key to a presidential suite to Qin Amlin and said carefully, "Our little boss Pei said that whether President Qin, Mr. Yi, or both of them at the same time, the GM would provide services for free." With that she blinked. The presidential suite has 0.01 yuan. Qin Amlin's face darkened. What did she mean by he had needs? Yi Liangqiu had needs. Pei Qiqi. He gritted his teeth. However, the woman behind him did not give him any face at all. She giggled and said, "All right, I'll come more often in the future." The receptionist looked carefully at Qin Amlin and found that his face had turned green. He angrily asked Yi Liangqiu to walk on her own, but she still clung to him and insisted on carrying him. The receptionist did not dare to laugh and sent them off. Qin Amlin carried the drunk cat to the suite and threw her on the bed. He was furious and did not want to talk to her. Thus he walked straight to the door. A pair of soft hands hugged his waist from behind. Then she pressed her face against his back. She pressed against him and murmured, "Amlin, don't go." His body froze. "Yi Liangqiu, do you know what you're saying? Don't go," she murmured. "At least not tonight." She hugged his body without a care. She closed her eyes slightly and blushed. She started kissing him through his shirt. Although it was autumn, and he didn't wear much, his body was boiling hot. Qin Amlin stood still. After a long time, he said in a painful voice, "Yi Liangqiu, do you know what you are doing?" "I know." She hugged him tightly. I know. After she said, "I know" countless times, he finally couldn't take it anymore and turned his head, cupped her face and kissed her. He didn't care if she was a dirty child or not. He didn't care about the past. He only cared about the present. He wanted to kiss her and take her. He was so tense that it hurt. He folded her in his arms, so she also felt pain. Her body moved back, and in the end, she half knelt beside the bed. He lowered his head and kissed her, his large palm pressing against the back of her head. It was like the end of the world. It was like the last time. He carried all his emotions, his anger towards her, his unforgiveness towards her, his love for her, and his reluctance to part with her were all in this kiss. They stumbled and fell together. She lay on her back, looked at him, and gently stroked his eyebrows with her fingers. "Amlin, do you hate me?" He was a little more clear-headed now. He half propped himself up and gazed at her deeply. After a long time he said softly, "Hate me." He flipped himself to the side, fell down, and closed his eyes. "You're not drunk, are you?" "I'm drunk. I'm awake again. I'm drunk again," she said softly. Her heart was also sad. In the end he didn't want her. She knew that he couldn't get over it, which also showed how unforgiving he was. She moved herself, put her face on his shoulder, and said softly, "Amlin, will you be with Xiaomian?" He didn't answer. He turned sideways and held her little face, making her look at him. Chapter 1629. Yi Liangqiu raised her head slightly and touched his neck. "Just like this, to let her do the same to you." He pulled her down and said sternly, "Yi Liangqiu." She chuckled. "Amlin, I thought you had imagined it." Perhaps because she was too despicable, and he hated her too much, he turned over and pressed her down to kiss her. This time, he did not stop and did it thoroughly. When it was over, he seemed to regret it a little. He wrapped a towel around himself and leaned against the headboard, holding a cigarette in his hand. Yi Liangqiu fell asleep. She lay on her side, revealing her creamy back. He smoked silently. After venting, his body felt even emptier. Loneliness engulfed his soul. He felt terrible and lowered his head to look at her. She was in a deep sleep. She was drunk and had fallen into a deep sleep. However, his heart was as heavy as water. Her drunken stupor was not as simple as it seemed. He smoked for a long time, and Yi Liangqiu, who had fallen asleep, woke up. Anlin? She called his name softly. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes. After a long time, he threw away the cigarette in his hand. I can't sleep. Before she could say anything, he laid on top of her. It was different from before. This time, he was obviously much more rough, as though he was venting some unknown emotions. After torturing her for a long time, he only let go of her when the sky was bright. At this moment, not only her, but he was also exhausted. They lay down in each other's arms. Perhaps, it was only when they were weak and confused that they could embrace each other and be together peacefully. At 10 in the morning, Yi Liangqiu woke up slowly. She hugged her pillow. He had already left. She did not open her eyes. She could only smell the faint smell of tobacco in the air. This round of sex was not within their expectations. It was something she had done on the spur of the moment. She was afraid of losing, so she gave. Sitting up, her gaze landed on the rubbish bin at the side. There were 7 or 8 001s there, all from last night. As the saying goes, hunger and thirst. She smiled, got up, and walked into the bathroom. Lying in the bathtub, she looked at her skin that had been tortured beyond recognition. He hadn't changed at all. It was just that in that kind of situation, he was a bit more resentful. Naturally, he was more ruthless than before. Yi Liangqiu scooped up the water and was thinking when the bathroom door opened. Qin Anlin stood neatly at the door with a paper bag in her hand. Judging from the label, it was what she usually wore. Change your clothes. I'll send you to the company later. Yi Liangqiu was still lying in the bathtub. She smiled and said, I thought you left. He gave her a long look and said nothing. Yi Liangqiu splashed the water and slowly got up. His gaze fell on her body, and he looked at her deeply. Get dressed and come out for breakfast, he lightly ordered. She slowly wiped her body with a towel, and after a while she said softly, You look like you're not satisfied yet? If I wasn't satisfied, I wouldn't have troubled Mr. Yi. He lowered his head in annoyance, turned around and walked out. She smiled faintly. She didn't mean what she said. When she got dressed and went out, Qin Anlin was already sitting in the dining room. The amazing thing was that the bedroom had been cleaned. The 8 001s had become the topic of conversation for the GM. Eat quickly, he lightly said, watching her sit down. Yi Liangqiu tasted it and knew that it was what she usually ate. She looked up and asked, You went out to buy it? Chapter 1630. Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything else, and just quietly ate her porridge. Occasionally, she would look up and see Qin Anlin scrolling through the news on his cell phone. She would then lower her head and take a small sip of porridge. After a long time, he put his cell phone away and looked at her quietly. Done eating? She replied and wiped her lower lip. Let's go. Qin Anlin looked at her for a long time before saying lightly, Okay. He walked out first and lit a cigarette at the door to wait for her. When Yi Liangqiu walked out, she looked at him and said, You smoked so much? Are you worried about me? He smiled coldly. You don't have to. As he walked, he said, I took precautions last night, so there won't be any unbreakable relationship between us. Yi Liangqiu stopped in her tracks and didn't leave. He turned his head and looked at her, pursing his lips. What's the matter now? She looked at him for a long time before saying slowly, Qin Anlin, you're getting more and more duplicitous, do you know that? Qin Anlin glared at her. After a while, he walked forward and extinguished the cigarette butt. She stood behind him and smiled quietly. She seemed to be in a good mood as she followed behind him. When they reached the hotel lobby, the receptionists looked at Qin Anlin with awe. After all, he had broken the highest record of the night at GM Hotel, which was 8 Sinamoto Platinum. However, Qin Anlin's face was dark, and he walked out quickly. So did Yi Liangqiu. She put on her sunglasses and didn't dare to take a single step. The two of them went out together. At the entrance of GM Hotel, they were surrounded by more than 10 reporters. The cameras were frantically taking pictures of them. Of course, they could also capture the kiss marks on Yi Liangqiu's neck and the shallow scratch marks on Qin Anlin's neck. Qin Anlin was a little annoyed. He reached out to block the camera and instinctively pulled Yi Liangqiu behind him. Mr. Qin, have you reconciled with Miss Yi? President Qin, I want to know if you and Miss Yi have ever divorced. President Qin, did you and Miss Yi sleep in the same room last night? Qin Anlin's face was dark. He pushed those people away and pulled Yi Liangqiu to the parking lot. He got into the car and blocked the annoying reporters outside, but his expression was still not good. Yi Liangqiu turned to look at him. Why are you so angry? What do you think, Mr. Yi? Who would benefit the most from the release of this news? His voice was a little cold, completely different from the fiery passion of last night. So you guessed it was me? She didn't think much of it. She just leaned against the back of the chair and looked out the window. After a long time, she turned around and smiled. But President Qin, you're right. I did it. Because ATV needs such favorable news. I think ATV's stock will rise a lot today. President Qin, it's all thanks to you. Yi Liangqiu. He squeezed out the words from between his teeth. Was everything last night a trap? If President Qin can bear such a result, I say yes, she said softly in a very indifferent tone. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes, and the car stopped by the side of the road. With a squeak, the back of her head hit the back of the chair. She turned her head to look at him. Get out of the car. His voice was as cold as ice. He turned his head, and his eyes were also cold. Yi Liangqiu, you're good. She put her hand on the handle of the car door and smiled. Thank you, President Qin, for your compliment. Get out of the car, he said again. She opened the car door and got out without hesitation. Chapter 1631. Only then did she realize that her bag and cell phone were in his car. She didn't have a single cent on her, and she was wearing high heels. She stared in the direction of his car for a long time, and her eyes were steaming. She had said those words out of anger just now. Yes, she had deliberately seduced him, but that was limited to the relationship between them, and had nothing to do with the interests of ATV. The appearance of those reporters was clearly the work of someone with ulterior motives. As for who it was, she could guess. What made her angry was that he didn't even ask her to explain, and directly suspected her. It was good that it was a misunderstanding. It would be good if he died of anger. She thought a little angrily, as she walked forward in her 3-inch high heels. How far was it? It didn't matter how long her legs were. She had no cell phone, no money, and her legs were very sore and painful. She simply sat on a bench by the side of the road. She actually saw a few coins in the mud. She carefully dug them out. Although there was only mud on them, it made her feel that her luck wasn't that bad. She washed the coins and found a random bus to sit on. She didn't care where she was going. She just wanted to sit. She needed to calm down. She would be sad too. Qin Anlin, I'm not invulnerable, and I'm not made of iron. I can get hurt too. She sat in an unknown place for the whole morning. When the news of them staying together for a night came out, the news in B City blew up. The shareholders of King Entertainment put a lot of pressure on Qin Anlin. One had to know that King Entertainment was committed to buying ATV. Now that such news had come out, wasn't it giving the other party a chance to breathe? As long as Yi Liangqiu accepted an interview and said that her marriage with President Qin was good, then ATV might be able to get out of its doldrums. Moreover, Yi Liangqiu's identity as a celebrity queen was still very appealing. Qin Anlin held a meeting for the whole morning. His face was getting darker and darker. In the end, it was so dark that it could drip water. When the meeting ended, Keim followed him into the office with a serious expression. President Qin, what should we do now? Qin Anlin didn't speak. Keim continued. The two things that the shareholders said today are simply nonsense. It sounds like they are trying to force him to abdicate. It was ridiculous. She said that she could either ask President Qin to divorce, or hold a press conference to announce that they were separated. Qin Anlin sat behind his desk and said calmly, she said she did it. Keim was stunned. Then he said slowly, President Qin, no matter what happened between you and Miss Yi, I don't think she will. He paused. She should be afraid. Qin Anlin looked at him. You're afraid of losing it, so you're desperately trying to hold on to it. Kaim smiled bitterly. I know this feeling the best. Qin Anlin pursed his lips and said nothing more. As for why she said that, President Qin can ask her. Just don't cause further misunderstanding. Kaim sighed and walked out, leaving Qin Anlin alone. When he walked out, Kaim smoked a cigarette and looked a little lost. Last night, he had gone to pick up Ingjie. Ingjie didn't seem to be drunk, but she was actually drunk. Later, she had vomited in his car. After vomiting, she had told him a story in the night. It was a familiar, sad and long story. The main characters of the story were him and Ingjie. Ingjie had always liked a boy who was much younger than her. She had always liked him, and she had always been waiting for that person to speak. However, he couldn't speak. Chapter 1632. Last night, Kaim and Ingjie sat in that bar all night. She said a lot of drunken things, and he listened in silence, but he didn't respond. When she cried, he gave her a shoulder, but he couldn't give her a hug. His hug was given to Su Cheng, to Nian Nian's mother. Yes, his and Su Cheng's child was called Su Nian. After his mother found out that the child's surname was Su and his name was Su Nian, she was silent for a long time and didn't say anything. After that, she didn't force him to go on blind dates again, and only helped him take care of the child. She probably knew that he was waiting for Su Cheng, and it was useless for her to force him, so she didn't force him. That night, Ingjie said a lot, and he remembered it all in his heart. But he could only remember it in his heart, and nothing else. Kaim finished his cigarette and smiled faintly. He might feel a little melancholy, but he wouldn't regret it. Falling in love with someone, and missing out on someone. What was there to regret? His Cheng Cheng was more passionate than anyone else, and he wasn't dissatisfied with anything. Just thinking about her little vixen appearance, his heart was also satisfied. After Kaim left, Qin Anlin sat in his office and repeatedly watched the news about him and Yi Liangxiu, his body leaning heavily against the back of the chair. At this moment, it wasn't that he didn't feel conflicted. His heart had softened towards her. In fact, no matter who did it, he should kill ATV right now. The shareholder's suggestion was very effective, and it was what he should do. But he still couldn't kill her. Before Yi Liangxiu took over ATV, he had forced ATV into a corner and abandoned many projects. But after she took over, he didn't move forward. He reached out to wipe his face and looked at the bag and phone beside him. It was Yi Liangxiu who dropped it in his car. He pursed his lips, picked it up, and slid open her phone. She had saved the photo of them in her phone, especially the one taken when they sat on the bed together. She had always kept it. His slender fingers slowly stroked her face in the photo, and after a long time he put it down. He reached out and pressed the intercom. Kaim. Kaim came over after a while. Knowing that he had made up his mind, he waited quietly. Break a piece of news and suppress this one. Qin Anlin's tone was flat. Kaim smiled. Yes, President Qin. Just like that, there was no movement. Qin Anlin lowered his eyes and lit a cigarette. Kaim coughed lightly. President Qin, don't smoke so much. Qin Anlin looked at him for a long time, then slowly said, You're different. Kaim retreated out of the room. When he went out, Qin Anlin looked at the cigarette between his fingers, and his expression was a little serious. He remembered that when he smoked yesterday, Liangxiu also said the same thing. Anlin, smoke less. Does she still care about him? Qin Anlin pressed the internal line again, and Kaim came over again. Send this to ATV, and hand it over to Boss Yi. He pointed to the woman's handbag and mobile phone at the side. Kaim was stunned for a moment. Then Mr. Yi is, he paused. Does Mr. Yi have money on him? Qin Anlin looked at him and pursed his lips. Send it over, and hand it to her personally. Kaim understood that he obviously couldn't let it go, so he drove to the ATV personally, but he didn't see Yi Liangxiu. He heard from Linda that Mr. Yi hadn't come back and couldn't be contacted. Chapter 1633. By then it was already afternoon. Qin Anlin drove with one hand and held a cigarette in the other, looking straight ahead. He had mixed feelings. He should be cruel to her, But he couldn't do it. He kept pushing his limits, including the duty of having sex with her. Qin Anlin was, after all, a man who had indulged himself for an entire night, so he didn't eat much. He drove around like this for 2 or 3 hours, and when night fell, his legs were no longer soft. However, he didn't give up and continued to search. Linda would also keep an eye out for her to see if she returned to the Sioux residence or the company, but there was still no news of her at 7 at night. Qin Anlin threw away the cigarette butt, wiped his face, and continued to drive. It was an early autumn night, and it drizzled, forming a cold reflection on the road. There were fewer and fewer pedestrians, and even the occasional bus that passed by only had 2 or 3 people in it. Qin Anlin drove past a bus. In a flash, he saw Yi Liangqiu sitting by the window. Her long hair was loose, and the window was down. She reached out as if to catch the drizzle from the sky. Her expression was almost pious, as she looked up at the sky at a 45-degree angle. At that time, she didn't look like a 28-year-old woman, but a 19-year-old girl. At that moment, Qin Anlin felt the whole sky was gorgeous, as if countless fireworks were blooming in front of her. Her facial features and even her pores were so clearly visible under the street lights in the dark night. The car passed by, as if in slow motion. He looked up, almost looking up. At that moment, she was in a sorry state, but his heart was violently moved, and only she could move him like this. As long as she was willing, she could always be the Yi Liangqiu who stood at the top. The black sports car screeched and made a sharp turn, following the bus from afar. He didn't want to be discovered by her, so he greedily looked at her happy face. Happy, but he could still see a touch of sadness. It had been a long time since he had seen her new work, but he still believed that Yi Liangqiu's performance was the highest level of performance. It made him forget about her, forget that she was the woman he loved and hated. But he hated her. Did she know it was dangerous? The car followed the bus all the way to the bus stop. She finally got out of the car. She got out of the car alone. She stood below and said something to the chauffeur. She smiled and then looked over. Qin Anlin had already gotten out of the car. He leaned against the door and looked at her deeply. Yi Liangqiu walked towards him slowly. I gave the driver an autograph, and he let me ride for a day. So you didn't care about other people's worries, and just took the bus around alone for a day? His voice was repressed and a little strict. He wanted to ask her if she had eaten, but he couldn't bring himself to ask. Because if he did that, it would seem like he cared too much. Yeah. She was still smiling, looking a little carefree. You have to hide after doing something wrong. He looked at her deeply and frowned. After a long time, he took her bag and cell phone from the car. She took it. Thank you. He didn't move, but his gaze deepened. Chapter 1634. She walked forward on the empty street. She didn't seem to mind, and walked casually on her own. As he looked at her, his eyes were a little hot, and he was a little annoyed at her. Suddenly, he grabbed her arm and dug his fingers deep into her flesh. However, she didn't seem to feel any pain, as she turned around and smiled. What's wrong? You called me Anlin. He spat out word by word. Yi Liangqiu, you deserve to die. How can you act as though nothing happened? As though it has nothing to do with you. All the love and hate I have for you are just my own imagination, he said angrily before lowering his head and kissing her. His arms locked her body as he pulled her into his embrace. He hugged her so deeply, as though he wanted to carve this woman into his bones and blood. Their lips rubbed against each other like boiling lava, burning her and him at the same time. They hugged each other and stumbled around, but there was nowhere for them to lean on. In the end, they ended up leaning against a tree trunk. He kissed her passionately. Her breath was sucked out of her as she couldn't breathe, and could only cling on to him. He let out a gasp and kissed her crazily. Finally, he let go of her before both of them were suffocated. Her breathing was messy, as she leaned her head against the tree trunk and looked up at him. Her eyes were beautiful, as though they were filled with the entire starry sky. He suddenly covered her eyes with his hand and said hoarsely, Yi Liangqiu, I actually hate you. She panted for a long time before she removed his hand. I know, Their gazes met for a long time in silence. His unwillingness, his wretched state, and his willingness to let go. They were all clear and aware of it. That was why there was such a rough kiss. Her red lips were still slightly swollen at this moment. He took a step back and seemed to have calmed down. I'll send you back. She didn't reject him because she was really tired. Qin Anlin walked towards the car and said indifferently, "There's no use in hurting yourself. I won't go soft no matter what." She followed behind him. She knew what he was talking about. She got into the car and fastened the seatbelt. "You didn't do anything today." Qin Anlin tilted his head and looked at her in an unfriendly manner. He slowly said, "Just think of it as last night's fare. It's so expensive." Yi Liangqiu rubbed her fingers. "Even ATV's stock rose today, and it's probably worth billions." Qin Anlin was a little annoyed. "Yi Liangqiu, don't go too far." "Is that so? President Qin, did I go too far?" Yi Liangqiu sneered. "As for your accusation, I just didn't deny it. And you think I did it? Why don't you doubt if it's a romantic debt? Why don't you think it's a stupid thing done by your girlfriend with a low IQ?" Qin Anlin was stunned. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly again. "President Qin, I believe your IQ should be on the line." He was almost fuming with anger. "Why didn't you deny it in the morning?" "Because you suspected me. It's not the first time I've experienced something like pulling up my pants and refusing to admit it." Her voice also became cold. "But I still want to thank President Qin for not killing me. And coming to find me. Is it hard?" Her face was sincere, but in his eyes, it was extremely hateful. When did Yi Liangqiu become so cunning? Chapter 1635. "You won't sleep with me or you won't be so stupid again?" she asked fearlessly. Qin Anlin clenched his fists. He really wanted to throw a tantrum at that little face, but he realized he couldn't. When a woman turns on you, you know how powerless you are. But he knew more bitterly that it was because he loved her dearly. "There won't be a next time," he added. "I won't sleep with you again." She nodded in agreement. After all, there are still many women in the harem of King Entertainment who can satisfy you. He glared at her and ignored her. He sat up straight and started the car. She said fearlessly, "Qin Anlin, you better not have a baby or I'll sue you for adultery." He couldn't take it anymore. "Get out." She really wanted to get out. But he still held her down. With nowhere to vent his complicated emotions, he started the car angrily. But the car was a little fast. It was a little frightening in the rainy night. Yi Liangqiu's fingers were on her chest, and her face was pale. "Qin Anlin, I haven't eaten for a day. I want to throw up." He didn't look too good, but he slowed down the car. After driving a few roads, he found a porridge shop and parked the car on the side of the road. The shop wasn't big and had a small storefront, but it was very clean. She sat in the car and didn't move. Qin Anlin took out a cigarette and lit it. When he lowered his head to light the fire, he said calmly, "Didn't you say you were hungry? Get out." She looked at him, as if she had just woken up from a dream. She opened the car door slowly, but her hand was held down by him. "Yi Liangqiu, this is the last time I'm going to compromise for you." His voice was low and hoarse, filled with indignation. She said "oh" again, which was rare for her to be so naive and sweet. "Don't give me that, I'm not having it." His voice was tense, and had a hint of huskiness. Yi Liangqiu said, "oh" again. After a long time she asked, "Then what do you want to eat?" In the dark car, his gaze was deep, as if there was a flame in it as he looked at her. Her body shuddered. They both remembered the nights they had shared, the joy and love they had shared, how he had taken her little by little, eaten her up, and how she couldn't take it anymore. "Get out of the car." Finally, he said hoarsely and let go of her. Her body felt light, and she almost slipped when she got out of the car. The sky was still drizzling, and it felt cold when she went out. She wrapped her arms around the mouth of the Xiong family. Soon, a coat was put on her shoulders, and she looked up in surprise. "Go in." Qin Anlin was only wearing a black shirt and holding a cigarette in his hand, but he still looked noble. He was out of place here, but his expression was one of extreme ease. When the lady boss of the kanji shop saw the handsome man, she happily greeted him. Sir, madam, what would you like to eat? Qin Anlin sat down and looked at Yi Liangqiu. What do you want to eat? Seafood porridge, she said without thinking. However, Qin Anlin said, 2 servings of lean pork with century eggs and a plate of beef river. I want seafood porridge, she emphasized. Qin Anlin looked at her. You're cold and you still want to eat seafood? Yi Liangqiu, do you want to rely on me when you're sick? The lady boss looked at one and the other, and was still grinning from ear to ear. She was especially good at chatting. Oh, I thought it was a couple. It's a farewell meal for little Jing. My place is close to the hotel, so there are many people who come to this meal. But everyone is still friends after this meal. The lady boss even winked at Qin Anlin, indicating that she was still single and could ask him out. Chapter 1636. The moment Qin Anlin finished speaking, the lady boss blushed. Ah, why didn't you say so earlier? With that said, she turned her thick waist and went to place the order. Yi Liangqiu looked around. The customers sitting around were dressed rather casually. They must be the residents living nearby. She inadvertently raised her eyes to look at Qin Anlin. He was currently smoking and looking at her with a burning gaze. Yi Liangqiu's eyes narrowed. Then she took out her phone and played with it. Why did you keep my photo? His voice suddenly sounded, giving her a shock. She looked at him and looked down. I'll just delete it. You can try. His voice was low and slightly cold. She looked at him strangely again. His gaze was also gloomy, as if she owed him 3 million yuan. However, what she owed him was not just 3 million yuan. She owed him a life, his mother's life. Her eyes dimmed, and she did not speak anymore. There was a subtle feeling between the two of them. After a while, the owner of the wind flea came over with a 7-inch bucket waist. She held a tray in her hand and put down the things that Qin Anlin had ordered one by one. She smiled charmingly. How can a couple not quarrel? Come to my place for supper and good food. It's not a small amount. With that said, she glanced at the hotel not far away. If you can't have a meal, you can rest there. After a night of rolling in the sheets, there won't be any more conflicts. After he finished speaking, he glanced at Qin Anlin in an especially seductive manner. His gaze paused on his Xiongnu mouth for a moment, and only then did he twist his thick waist and leave, his eyes filled with all kinds of emotions. Qin Anlin and Yi Liangqiu looked at each other. After a long while she sighed softly. The lady boss is quite passionate. If she was younger she would have liked you. Qin Anlin reached for his bowl. After taking a bite he looked up. Yi Liangqiu, no one will think that you're mute if you don't speak. He paused. Or do you want to go to the hotel over there? Yi Liangqiu was hungry. She took small bites and said softly, You're the one who wants to go with Lady Boss. He glared at her, but she said nothing more. The warm porridge soothed her stomach, and she even let out a soft sigh of satisfaction. He caught it, and after looking up at her, he didn't say anything. After Yi Liangqiu finished her porridge, she began to attack the Pan Nyo River. The taste was unexpectedly good. She had only moved her chopsticks a few times when Qin Anlin also extended his chopsticks and blocked her chopsticks. The two of them were like children competing with each other. Qin Anlin, you're childish. She couldn't beat him, so she flew into a rage out of humiliation. He ate gracefully. Even though it was a snack shop, he could still eat with dignity. After finishing half of the plate, he rewarded her. Don't you want to maintain your figure? Besides, people who have been starving for a long time should not overeat. She looked at the plate of porridge that he had eaten. Actually, she wanted to eat it, but he had already finished half the plate, so it was a little strange for her to eat again. Qin Anlin lit a cigarette. Why? Do you think it's dirty? She was afraid that he would say something shameless again, so she lowered her head and ate without making a fuss. Before Qin Anlin could say anything, the lady boss came out. When she saw the scene, she couldn't stop smiling. I knew it. A meal is enough. The lady boss wiped her hands and suddenly took out a coupon from her greasy pocket. She said mysteriously, Take this and stay there. You can get a 20% discount. Chapter 1637. After saying that, the lady boss bit her plump lips, shook her waist and left. Yi Liangqiu's mouth was still full of food as she stared at Qin Anlin with her eyes wide open. Qin Anlin was also holding the coupon in his hand as he looked at her with a burning gaze. Just when she thought that he was going to throw it away, he folded it and put it in his pocket. Yi Liangqiu spat out the stir-fried noodles in her mouth. Qin Anlin glared at her. And there was some on his face too. Actually, she had never lost her composure like this before. But she never thought that he would be like this. How could Qin Anlin be interested in such a cheap place? How do you know who I won't bring there? He wiped his face with a piece of tissue and was no longer in the mood. He paid the money first and waited for her in the car. Yi Liangqiu snuck glances at him as he ate, and then secretly laughed. Qin Anlin sat in the car with the window down. He smoked and looked at her from time to time, or rather he was glaring at her. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and couldn't help but smile. It had been a long time since he saw her smile like this. Although he hated her, he still looked at her greedily. She finished her food slowly, opened the car door and sat beside him. Qin Anlin still had half of his cigarette and looked at her. Aren't you afraid that I'll drag you to a hotel? That's exactly what I want, she said mysteriously. Qin Anlin glanced at her, his gaze cold. Whatever. She opened her palm, and there was a coupon on it too. The lady boss said that you're a little fierce and asked me to make plans in case it doesn't work out. Yi Liangqiu chuckled. I think it's better to find someone else. His face darkened as he glared at her. Yi Liangqiu, don't you dare. If you dare, I dare. She said these 5 words. She finally said these 5 words. Qin Anlin, this is not a threat. This is the truth. Her tone became cold. If you mess around with any model or celebrity, I'll make sure you're a cuckold too. She paused for a long time before continuing. Unless we get a divorce. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, and he put out the cigarette. Yi Liangqiu, you're the first one who dares to be so arrogant after doing something wrong. With that, he took the coupon from her hand, tore it into pieces and threw it away. After that, he started the car. Probably because he was angry with her. He did not speak again until he dropped her off in front of the Su residence. He did not get out of the car. Instead, he sat in the car and his tone became cold. What happened in the past 2 days ends here. I hope that Mr. Yi won't overthink it. I won't overthink it, don't worry. Her voice was slightly bitter, and she looked down. I'm leaving. His fingers closed on her arm, and she turned her head. In the dim light, his gaze was unfathomable as it locked onto her face. Yi Liangqiu, have you ever regretted it? His voice was slightly hoarse. Have you ever regretted your choice? He was not a fool. He could still feel that she loved him. If she didn't love him, she wouldn't be willing to sleep with him, and she wouldn't eat with him. In this short day, she was even greedy for it. Even when she went missing today, she hoped that he would look for her. But Yi Liangqiu, shouldn't she give something in order to get it? His gaze was burning, and she could not avoid it. She said softly, I don't have a chance to regret it, Anlin. There's no turning back. Chapter 1638. Yi Liangqiu, go. Qin Anlin's tone was calm. Just pretend that nothing happened in the past 2 days. Yi Liangqiu's gaze fell on his face. After a long while she chuckled. Okay. One was in the car, and the other was outside. Under the faint moonlight, their gazes met, and they stared at each other for a long time. He looked at her for a long time before he finally closed the car window. The black sports car disappeared into the night. She stood there for a long time. So long that she almost didn't want to return to the Su residence. Only when her legs were a little sore did she slowly walk in. The guard opened the door and said softly, Sir is back. Su Shurqing? Why was he back? Shouldn't I be his tortoise, curling up and living a few more years? Yi Liangqiu walked towards the hall. Her footsteps were quick, and without any hesitation. The guard looked at her back view, and was a little worried. The Su residence was brightly lit. Su Shurqing was wearing a white suit, and looked a little flustered. He was bending over and looking at little Momo lovingly. The moment she saw little Momo, her heart calmed down. She walked over slowly and said calmly, "You're here? This is my home." Su Shirching looked up and frowned. He emphasized, but he didn't feel good. This was his home, but he had been in dire straits for the past year. He couldn't return home, and was afraid that Qin Anlin would run over with a gun and point it at him at any time. He had to hide here and there, and his days were miserable. Yi Liangqiu smiled. "Yes, you can stay here for a long time too." Su Shirching was stunned. He was angry. He had given birth to this daughter for nothing. If he didn't need her, he wouldn't have had to be so submissive. His gaze shifted and landed on Yi Liangqiu. He closed his eyes and spat out a long sentence. "Who are you with?" Yi Liangqiu looked down at herself. She was wearing Qin Anlin's jacket, so she said calmly, "Qin Anlin." Su Shirching opened his eyes and stared at her. Then, he handed little Momo over to a servant. When little Momo was carried upstairs, his gaze turned cold. "Bastard! How could you hang out with him? Have you forgotten your mission?" Yi Liangqiu took off her jacket, kicked off her high heels and ignored Su Shirching. She walked to the bar and poured herself a glass of red wine. After taking a sip, she said lightly, "Of course I didn't forget. There's no conflict." Su Shirching's eyes were a little hot, because her attitude was too casual. It was as if she was used to this place, and treated it as her real home. This was very subtle. It was not his home, but this place. It was Yi Liangqiu's home. Although he was unhappy, he continued to make things difficult for her and Qin Anlin. Yi Liangqiu smiled and said, "It's just a consensual act after getting drunk. It's nothing." "What about now?" Su Shirching's eyes were shrewd. He narrowed his eyes and stared at her. "Are you drunk again tonight?" Yi Liangqiu held a glass of red wine and walked over to sit down. Her posture was perfect. She reached out to push her long hair to the back of her head and turned her face. "If you knew that the matter between me and Qin Anlin was on the news, you wouldn't have said that." Her expression was slightly cold. At this time, if Qin Anlin announced that we were divorcing or separating, do you think ATV would still be so calm today? She sneered. "You're probably anxious to hold a shareholders' meeting." Chapter 1639. You don't believe me? She held the glass and played with the expensive crystal glass with her slender fingers. She smiled and said, "Then I won't see him in private anymore." Su Shirching hesitated when he heard that. Indeed, Yi Liangqiu was telling the truth. ATV was on its last breath. If Qin Anlin wanted to, he might not be able to hold on for long. Seeing that Su Shirching didn't speak, Yi Liangqiu continued, "Qin Anlin doesn't like to use personal matters to suppress me. Why should I send myself to my death?" This time, Su Shirching nodded and said, "That's true." He thought for a moment and said shamelessly, "If necessary, you can contact him." He felt that it was too obvious, so he coughed and said, "You're still husband and wife, aren't you?" Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and didn't say anything. Su Shirching chuckled and said, "Liangqiu, I'm not unreasonable. If you like Qin Anlin, you can be with him in the end," but his voice was resolute and decisive. "We have to take down King Entertainment. You should know what to do. Honey trap? I might not be that charming." Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. "He has so many beauties around him. Maybe he doesn't care anymore, or maybe one day, he'll hate me." "Dad, you don't think he'll still like me when he realizes what I want to do, do you?" Su Shirching smiled deeply and said, "That depends on your ability. But the beauties you mentioned just now, are you referring to the girl named Xiaomian?" Su Shirching smiled darkly and said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of her for you." Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything, nor did she refuse. Her heart had long been cold and hard. Xiaomian, she had warned her. She held the red wine in her fingers and slowly drank half a glass. Su Shirching looked at her with satisfaction and said, "Liangqiu, you're becoming more and more like me." She tilted her face and smiled charmingly. "Really?" Su Shirching frowned again and said, "Don't you not smoke or drink? What about Momo?" "It's broken." Yi Liangqiu's voice sounded a little indifferent. You won't get drunk if you drink once in a while. Su Shirching nodded. That's good. I have to go. I don't want to upset you here. He complained like a child. I really don't know if this is your house or my house. With that said, he walked out with his cane, followed by his bodyguards. Yi Liangqiu stopped him. Wait a minute. Su Shirching stopped and turned back to look at her. Liangqiu? Is he okay? Yi Liangqiu's voice was very faint. She stood there dignified and beautiful, the most desirable heir to his heart. Now that Su Shirching was old, he really wanted to hear her care for him. But she actually asked about that useless man Qin Pei. Su Shirching's gaze was slightly cold. He is not dead. With that said, he banged the cane in his hand hard on the floor tiles. Show her the photo. With that said, he stormed out of the room, looking a little sad. His subordinates wanted to show the photo to Yi Liangqiu, but Yi Liangqiu didn't look at it. She didn't want to see Qin Pei's miserable state. After staying alone for a while, she went upstairs to take care of Momo. But in her heart, she kept thinking about Qin Anlin, wondering if he was angry. But Anlin, no matter how angry you are, there are some things that I have to do. In the president's office of King Entertainment, Qin Anlin was sitting when someone knocked on the door. Chapter 1640. The door opened and Xia Mian followed behind Ying Jie, looking a little uneasy. Qin Anlin looked up at Ying Jie and said, Wait outside for a moment. Ying Jie nodded and glanced at Xia Mian. From the look on the girl's face, she must have done something bad to upset President Qin. She backed out and closed the door. Xia Mian stood by the door and didn't walk over. She clasped her hands and said in a soft voice, President Qin, I have rehearsal later. No need. Qin Anlin's tone was very calm. Starting from today, you'll have a month off. Xia Mian's face turned pale, and she cried out involuntarily. Why? Qin Anlin's tone became even colder. You know the reason. Under that kind of gaze, Xia Mian couldn't avoid it. She finally said in a soft voice, President Qin, I didn't do it on purpose. Biting her lip and looking down, she looked a little pitiful. I just don't think it's worth it for a woman like that. It's my business whether it's worth it or not. It's not up to others to interfere in my private affairs. Besides, Miss Xia is just an actress from King Entertainment. His voice was very cold. But do you know what it means to King Entertainment by doing this? President Qin can make a statement. Xia Mian blurted out in a moment of desperation. But she regretted it as soon as she said it. Her face was a little pale, and her eyes were also a little teary as she looked at Qin Anlin. Qin Anlin's expression became even colder. His voice was slow and deep. How did you know about the contents of the shareholders' meeting? Xia Mian didn't dare to look him in the eye. She turned her face to the side and said in an even lower voice, I heard it from someone. Qin Anlin didn't ask anymore, but his voice became even more stern. If there's a next time, you'll be fired from King Entertainment. It won't happen again. Xia Mian's face turned paler and paler. He didn't say much to her, because she was just an insignificant employee who had designs on him. But did he really not have any feelings for her? Xia Mian sounded innocent and squeezed out a weak smile. I can help Aunt Su take care of Mu Yun and little Mumu this month. No need. Qin Anlin looked at her with a strange look in his eyes. Miss Xia, I hope you remember that we won't have anything to do with each other except in the company. Don't cross the line. Xia Mian said yes with tears in her eyes. Qin Anlin didn't say anything more, and raised his hand to let her go out. When Xia Mian left, her eyes were red. Ying Jie immediately knew that she was the one who did it. That was why she was scolded by President Qin. President Qin asked you to come in. Xia Mian's voice was a little hoarse. Ying Jie nodded and glanced at Xia Mian. Xia Mian called out Ying Jie in a soft voice, but Ying Jie ignored her. Of course, she had to take responsibility for what she did. Ying Jie pushed the door open and went in. Xia Mian stood there, tears finally rolling down her face. She didn't know why President Qin knew about it. Someone must have sold her out. Those reporters took her money and dared to sell her out. Xia Mian bit her lip, her eyes full of resentment. At that moment, there was a clapping sound on the other side of the aisle. Xiaomian turned her head and saw that it was Emo Xiaoqi. In the past 6 months, she and Emo Xiaoqi had been fighting fiercely. Emo Xiaoqi bullied her because she was a founding member. But so what? In the future, it would be Xiaomian's world. King Entertainment had nothing to do with that old woman Emo Xiaoqi. Chapter 1641. Emo Xiaoqi swayed her body as she walked over and stood in front of Xiaomian. She played with her exquisite nails and said with a gloating tone, "Xiaomian, it's fine that you usually go head-on against me, but you actually overestimated yourself and provoked Yi Liangqiu? How much courage do you have? How much beauty do you have? How much shrewdness do you have to scheme against her?" Emo Xiaoqi smiled charmingly and leaned close to Xiaomian. "There are many women who want to sleep with President Qin, who have succeeded in all these years." Xiaomian said coldly, "Emo Xiaoqi, do you think everyone is like you?" Emo Xiaoqi shrugged and laughed exaggeratedly. "Don't be so arrogant. How can I not know what you're thinking? Don't look for shameless things to do. In President Qin's heart, there is only Yi Liangqiu. He is now Mr. Yi and the Queen of Music. Even if you struggle for 8 or 10 years, you can't reach his height." Emo Xiaoqi felt happy today. When Yi Liangqiu was around, she was unhappy, but this Xiaomian made her even more unhappy. As for Yi Liangqiu, at least President Qin liked her. Xiaomian, on the other hand, was stubbornly sticking to him and pretending to be innocent. Emo Xiaoqi hated her the most. Moreover, Xiaomian dared to stab her in the back. "Little girl, let's see if I can kill her." Emo Xiaoqi chuckled softly. "By the way, don't cry. President Qin won't feel sorry for you." Looking at Xiaomian's angry look, she was even happier. "By the way, the night before yesterday, President Qin and Mr. Yi must have been separated for a long time. I heard that President Qin's neck was full of scratches. How much strength did he use? Xiaomian, you were so close to him just now. Did you see it?" Xiaomian was so angry that she almost passed out. She said coldly, "I didn't see it." "That's true. President Qin doesn't allow you to get close to him." Emo Xiaoqi sighed. "I still have work to do, so I can't talk to you. I really envy you for being so free." After Emo Xiaoqi finished speaking, she smiled mockingly and left. Xiaomian stood there and clenched her fists. This Emo Xiaoqi was so hateful. She didn't leave. She wanted to wait for Ying Jie at the door. She begged Sister Ying to put in a few good words for her. She could not disappear for a month. Otherwise, her fans would forget about her. That was how cruel the entertainment industry was. If you didn't have enough exposure, the public would soon forget you. Unlike Yi Liangqiu, Mian and Xiaomian of Mian's, Mian Xiaomian, Mian Su Mian. In fact, she didn't need to Qin. Su with her, Mian Mian and Xia Su. Mian Shi of Su Xian said, "Su Mian I Mian Ti." Of Yi Su up Su Mian, Su of however, she still asked to test his reaction. Sure enough, Qin Anlin was stunned for a moment and then nodded. "This matter is over. Just take it as another scandal. It won't cause any more trouble." Ying Jie thought to herself that President Qin knew very well whether he could make a comeback or not. It was clear that Liang Qiu had later retaliated against him, deliberately making him unable to bear it, but he still softened. What happened to being cold-hearted and merciless? They had all been fed to the dogs. However, she didn't dare to tease her boss, so she only asked, "Xiaomian, does President Qin still want to support you?" Qin Anlin thought for a moment and said, "Let's see how she performs later. If something like this happens again, fire her immediately. Don't ask me." It didn't matter if King Entertainment had Xiaomian or not. Ying Jie interjected. When President Qin wanted to promote her, was it for King Entertainment or for President Qin himself? Chapter 1642. Qin Anlin looked at Ying Jie with a warning look, but Ying Jie looked innocent and didn't flinch or get scared. "You're becoming less and less afraid of me." Qin Anlin's tone was very calm. "Don't get involved with her and plot against me anymore." Ing Jie's expression became a little uncomfortable. She coughed lightly and said, "How is this a plot? I was just drinking. Besides, I can't drive even if I'm drunk." Qin Anlin gave her face and didn't say much. However, Ing Jie still asked Qin Anlin, "President Qin, you haven't answered the question just now?" Qin Anlin looked at her for a long time before he said faintly, "That's not important. It's President Qin, who hasn't thought about it properly either." Ing Jie smiled faintly. "Then President Qin can think about it carefully. He might have a better understanding of Xiaomian's future plans." She left after she finished speaking. Qin Anlin looked at the door thoughtfully. When Ing Jie walked out, she saw that Xiaomian was still there. Her eyes were a little swollen, as if she had been crying. "Why are you crying?" Ing Jie's voice was very calm. Xiaomian grunted in response. Then, she took Ing Jie's arm and said in a low voice, "Ing Jie, can you help me?" Ing Jie looked at Xiaomian with a somewhat serious expression. "Xiaomian, you're a newcomer to King Entertainment, and President Qin wants to promote you." She paused for a moment and said, "Xiaomian, don't forget you're an employee. You shouldn't have any improper thoughts about President Qin." Xiaomian was stunned. Her lips trembled and she quickly retorted, "But Yi Liangqiu was like this back then. President Qin was single at that time, and President Qin took the initiative to be with them." Ing Jie's tone became more and more serious. "Xiaomian, I think if you and President Qin had anything going on, it would greatly affect your career. Do you think Yi Liangqiu would let you off the hook if you and President Qin had anything going on?" After all, Xiaomian was still young and aggressive, so she immediately answered, "I'm not afraid. The premise of you not being afraid is that President Qin will protect you. Do you think that's possible?" Ing Jie gave the final warning. Xiaomian was not convinced. "Why isn't it possible?" Ing Jie was quite angry. "You won't cry until you see the coffin." She paused for a moment. "It's better to reflect on yourself at home." With that, Ing Jie walked towards the elevator. Xiaomian was stunned for a moment, then she followed. "Ing Jie." Xiaomian called out pitifully. Ing Jie turned her head and said, "You're on your own." She was not a soft-hearted person. Xiaomian's thoughts should be destroyed by herself. Otherwise, she would suffer in the future. Xiaomian stood there, watching the elevator open and close. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she clenched her fists. "Yi Liangqiu, I don't believe that I'm not as good as you," she murmured. She had to shine brightly. She had to be above everyone else, and become the real Empress of Heaven. In the top-floor office of the ATV, Linda stood in front of Yi Liangqiu's desk, reporting the situation. Yi Liangqiu looked up. "Frozen. I think she can't have any work for a month." Linda smiled. For a young star like Xiaomian, this is killing her. One had to know that King Entertainment could make such a decision at any time, and replace Xiaomian with someone else. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and said indifferently, "So she did it." Linda asked softly, "Mr. Yi what?" Chapter 1643. Linda, however, was still worried. What if Xiaomian is really frozen? Then wouldn't all the drama we spent 150 million yuan on go to waste? How could that be? Yi Liangqiu looked down. Don't underestimate this girl. She'll stop before she completely pisses off Qin Anlin. Because that was what Xiaomian had always done. But she wondered how Su Shiqing would treat Xiaomian. Would he use his usual tricks? Yi Liangqiu felt that she was quite cold-blooded. But she didn't need to feel guilty. Between her and Xiaomian, one of them would be hurt in the end, and it would be either her or Xiaomian. She wasn't a saint, so Xiaomian was destined to be cannon fodder. Yi Liangqiu flipped through the documents in her hands and said in a low and slow voice, "Set the broadcast date for around Christmas." Linda let out an ah to express her confusion. "I'll give Qin Anlin 3 months. If Xiaomian doesn't become popular, then there's no chance for her to do so." Yi Liangqiu smiled. Linda still didn't understand. If Xiaomian didn't become popular, would the advertisement for the drama still sell? Yi Liangqiu's eyes fell on Linda's face. She didn't say anything, but Linda shivered. Mr. Ye's expression was a bit like Mr. Su's. After ATV announced the schedule of summer solstice in Xiaomian, Xiaomian came to see Yi Liangqiu within 2 days. At first, she came to ATV to ask to see Xiaomian, but Linda stopped her. Miss Xia, Mr. Yi is in a meeting. I can wait. Xiaomian's tone was a little reserved. She had recently been named one of the foremost popular actresses of the new generation, which was also promoted by King Entertainment. Therefore, she thought highly of herself. Linda smiled. I'll go and see if Mr. Yi has time to see you. Linda walked into the meeting room and came out after a while. Sorry, Miss Xia. Mr. Yi's meeting may last until noon. Can you make an appointment another day? Xiaomian pursed her lips and said unhappily. I'm just going to say a few words. Is she busy? Miss Xia, if you want to see Mr. Yi, you have to make an appointment. Linda was also a little unhappy. What was wrong with this woman? She wasn't even famous yet, and she dared to come and provoke them. She didn't even know where she was. Xiaomian's voice was cold. Yi Liangqiu deliberately suppressed me. Can't I say a few words? Linda sneered. Suppress? Miss Xia, why do you think Mr. Yi needs to suppress you? Why would they suppress you? Because of what happened between me and President Qin. Xiaomian snorted. Linda cursed in her heart. Did he really think that he was something? About her and President Qin? Just as he was about to mock her, Yi Liangqiu came out. When he looked at Xiaomian, he paused for a moment, looking a little surprised. And behind her, there were more than 10 senior executives, as if they were stars surrounding the moon. Xiaomian looked at Linda and said aggressively, Didn't you say that the meeting won't end until noon? It's me who doesn't want to see you. Yi Liangqiu spoke for Linda. She stopped walking, and the people behind her also stopped and looked at Xiaomian. Yi Liangqiu smiled slightly. Miss Xia, you said that you have something to do with Anlin? Can you tell me what it is? Xiaomian was embarrassed by her straightforwardness. I really want to know what happened between my husband and another woman, Miss Xia. Yi Liangqiu rolled up the documents in her hand and gently patted her leg, looking relaxed. Chapter 1644. Yi Liangqiu smiled and said, Miss Xia, don't you think so? Xiaomian was embarrassed and embarrassed. A group of people were looking at her as a joke, and their eyes were obviously unkind. Her lips trembled, and she didn't speak. Yi Liangqiu smiled and said, Let's talk in my office. After all, it's a private matter. Linda made a gesture and said, Miss Xia, please. After that, she secretly sighed in relief. Mr. Yi was really smart. He knew why Xiaomian was here, but he didn't say anything. Wouldn't Xiaomian be anxious? Xiaomian followed Linda. Yi Liangqiu turned around and said a few words to a few executives before walking into the office. Linda poured a glass of water for Xiaomian and didn't leave. She stood there like a door god. Yi Liangqiu, I want to talk to you in private. Xiaomian's voice was a little stiff. Yi Liangqiu looked at Linda and then back at Xiaomian. She said lightly, There's nothing to avoid. Linda is my secretary. Xiaomian still wanted to say something, but Yi Liangqiu smiled and said, Miss Xia, please make it short. I have something to do later. Xiaomian pursed her lips and said, What I want to ask is, why did you schedule my film so long before Christmas? Linda poured a cup of tea for Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu took a sip, and then looked at Xiaomian. Did Qin Amlin ask you to come? I asked myself. Xiaomian's little face was a little tense, and the expression on her face was the stubborn one that Yi Liangqiu was familiar with. Yi Liangqiu's gaze fell on her face. After looking at her for a long time, he smiled faintly. Since you're the one who asked, please leave. Why? Xiaomian was unwilling to give up, so her tone was naturally not good. But she forgot that she was in an ATV. Yi Liangqiu sneered and said, Miss Xia, who do you think you are to question me? Xiaomian was stunned. After a long while she said softly, I'm the person President Qin likes. Linda couldn't stand it anymore. She had seen shameless people, but she had never seen such a shameless person. So Linda snorted coldly. President Qin likes you. So why didn't he stand up for you? But you came here yourself. You're so shameless. You're not a joke. Yi Liangqiu stopped her. Linda, show some respect to Miss Xia. After all, she is the person President Qin likes. Linda, on the other hand, stopped moving and stepped back. I got it. Then she solemnly apologized to Xia Mian. Miss Xia, I'm sorry. However, in Xia Mian's ears, these words sounded sarcastic, and she couldn't lose her temper. She was so angry that her face turned red. Yi Liangqiu glanced at Linda and smiled. Xia Mian was even angrier. Her face turned the color of pig liver. She pursed her lips and said, Mr. Yi, you haven't answered my question. Do you also want to know the internal secrets of ATV, Miss Xia? Yi Liangqiu's tone was very calm, and her eyes fell on Xia Mian's face. As for the relationship between Miss Xia and Anlin, I don't think it's necessary for you to specifically tell me. Qin Anlin is a married man. Miss Xia, you know better than anyone else. In the future, you should be more respectful of yourself. Xia Mian was really angry. Yi Liangqiu's words were a slap in the face. The film is mine. I have the right to know why, she said stubbornly. Yi Liangqiu didn't want to argue with her anymore. She said in a displeased and impatient tone, Linda, see our guest out. Linda had never seen such an insensible person. How could she make such a fuss? Chapter 1645. Xia Mian's eyes widened. No, I'm not done yet. Yi Liangqiu dialed a number. After the call went through, she said faintly, Qin Anlin, your woman Xia Mian, is making a scene in my office. Come and take her away. Xia Mian was shocked. President Qin? Her big watery eyes were wide open, and her face was full of fear. She really looked delicate and pitiful. No. Xia Mian bit her lip and said in a hoarse voice, Yi Liangqiu, you're so despicable. I'm just helping you. Yi Liangqiu sat up straight. It's up to you whether you want to leave or leave first. Xia Mian was furious. She bit her lip and said, Yi Liangqiu, you won't have a good ending. Really? Yi Liangqiu looked at her indignant face and smiled. Miss Xia, if you have the ability, you should pray for yourself. Xia Mian still wanted to say something, but she couldn't gain the upper hand. In the end, she could only leave angrily. As soon as she left, Linda said unhappily, Mr. Yi, you're too kind to her. If it were me, I would have asked the security guards to drive her away. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. There's no need for that. Xia Mian is too weak right now. Did you really call President Qin just now? Linda laughed. Xia Mian was obviously lying. If there was something going on between her and President Qin, she wouldn't have come here herself. She's so stupid. Yi Liangqiu smiled. No way, she paused for a moment. You just called 10086. Linda was stunned at first, but then she laughed. That's great. I don't think she'll dare to come here again. We'll have plenty of opportunities to meet in the future. Yi Qiuqiu looked down. Just wait and see. Xia Mian won't be so easy to get rid of. Indeed. Xia Mian understood when she went downstairs. She had been tricked by Yi Liangqiu. However, Xia Mian didn't dare to go up again. She stayed there for a month and begged Ing Jie for help. Although Ing Jie didn't like her, Ing Jie was a fair manager. King Entertainment had invested a lot in Xia Mian, so it would be unrealistic and capricious to let her go so easily. Whether or not she could become famous depended on Xia Mian's luck. Xia Mian worked even harder and didn't dare to act rashly anymore. When she overestimated herself and hit her head against the wall, she finally understood what it meant to wait for the right opportunity to strike. She already had some fame to begin with. In addition, she had appeared on a certain large-scale reality show, which gave her a very good image. She was the national goddess, so she seemed to have become popular all of a sudden. In a short period of time, she became a popular celebrity. She appeared on the news from time to time in various airport shows. Her hype was quite successful. Later on, during a fashion week, she outshone a popular celebrity and was in the limelight. Yi Liangqiu put down the magazine in her hand and looked at Linda. How's the advertising for summer solstice, Xia Mian, coming along? We haven't decided on the title sponsorship yet, but we've decided on the other commercials. Mr. Yi will be satisfied with the price." Linda smiled. Not only was this a tangible benefit, but it was also more than that for the ATV. Yi Liangqiu nodded. "Give it to that comfort bow sanitary pad." Linda froze for a moment, then understood. She held back her laughter. "Okay, I'll arrange for the contract to be signed." President Yi must have done it on purpose. In that commercial, Xia Mian was indeed seductive in her panties. It was good, and it would help the ratings as well. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.